The granite headstone stood cold and gray against the Montana sky, and Wade Hollister stood before it the way he'd stood before it every April 12th for 4 years now. The wildflowers in his hand were prairie lupin and Indian paintbrush, the same flowers Karen had picked on their first date 32 years ago when they were both young and stupid and thought love was enough to build a life on. He'd been wrong about a lot of things, but he'd been right about loving her. He just hadn't been right about showing it. The inscription was simple because Karen had been simple in the best way. Karen Marie Hollister, 1954 to 2010. Beloved wife and mother. She never stopped believing in second chances. Wade had picked those last words himself, sitting in the funeral home with a pen that felt like it weighed 10 pounds and a heart that felt like it weighed nothing at all because something that broken couldn't possibly be heavy. The funeral director had suggested something about angels or heaven or rest, but Wade had shaken his head. Karen didn't believe in pretty lies. She believed in work. She believed in fixing what was broken. She believed people could change if they tried hard enough. Wade knelt and placed the flowers against the stone, his knees protesting the movement. 58 wasn't old, but it wasn't young either, and 34 years of horse ranching had left their mark on his joints and his back and his hands. The ground was still cold from winter, that peculiar Montana spring cold that reminded you summer was a promise, not a guarantee. He brushed some dried leaves away from the base of the headstone, taking his time, because once he finished this small task he'd have to talk, and talking to Karen was getting harder instead of easier. "It's been 4 years," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. He lived alone now, and alone meant silence, and silence meant his voice sounded strange when he used it. 4 years and I still can't figure out how to say I'm sorry the right way. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the cemetery. That distinctive warble that meant spring was trying to shoulder winter aside. Karen had loved meadowlarks. She used to stand on the porch in the mornings with her coffee, listening to them, and Wade would be in the barn already because the horses needed feeding and fences needed checking, and there was always something that needed doing more than standing still and listening to birds. "Claire called last week," Wade continued, pulling a few weeds that had started growing near the stone. "She's good, teaching still. 5th grade this year. She asked about the ranch and I said it was fine, which is what I always say, so she knows it's not fine, but she doesn't push because we don't push each other. We're good at not pushing. We're good at staying on the surface where it's safe." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant snow from the mountains. Wade closed his eyes and let it wash over him, trying to remember what Karen's perfume had smelled like. Lavender, maybe. Or was that just wishful thinking, his mind filling in gaps with things that sounded right even if they weren't true? "I should have been there," he said, and his voice cracked on the words the way it always did when he got to this part. "The hospital called at 2:15. I remember because I was replacing a fence post on the south pasture, and I'd checked my watch right before the phone rang, thinking I'd better wrap up soon because dinner was at 6 and you didn't like it when I was late. They said come now. They said it was important. And I said I'd be there in an hour because I wanted to finish the fence line while I had the light." He opened his eyes and stared at the headstone, willing it to respond, to tell him he was forgiven or damned or anything at all. But granite was silent the way truth was silent, offering no comfort and no condemnation, just existing. "You died at 3:02, Wade said. "I got there at 3:12, 10 minutes. If I'd dropped the tools and run to the truck right then, if I'd driven like my life depended on it instead of like my fence posts did, I would have made it. You would have known I was there. You wouldn't have died alone." The meadowlark called again, closer now. Wade wondered if it was the same bird or a different one. He wondered if birds mated for life the way people claimed they did. He wondered if Karen had known at the end that he wasn't there. The doctors said she'd been unconscious, said she wouldn't have known either way, but Wade didn't believe them. Karen always knew when he wasn't there. She'd known for 20 years of marriage. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so damn sorry, Karen. And I know saying it to a stone doesn't fix anything. I know you're not here, but I don't know where else to put it." He stood slowly, his knees cracking, and brushed the dirt from his jeans. The cemetery was empty except for him and the stones and the birds. It was always empty when he came. He timed his visits that way, early morning on a Tuesday when normal people were at work, and he could pretend he was normal too, just a man visiting his wife's grave and not a man drowning in 4 years of things he should have said. The drive back to the ranch took 20 minutes on county roads that cut through prairie so vast it made you feel small in a way that was almost comforting. Wade drove with the windows down despite the cold because he liked the way the air stung his face and reminded him he was still here, still breathing, still taking up space in a world that would keep turning whether he figured out how to live in it or not. The radio was off. It was always off. Music felt like an intrusion, like someone shouting in a library. The Hollister Ranch sat on 80 acres of rolling grassland 15 miles south of Great Falls, tucked into a valley where the wind had less bite, and the grass grew thick enough to support horses year-round if you managed it right. Wade's grandfather had bought the land in 1943 for almost nothing because nobody wanted to ranch in Montana during a war when every able man was overseas and every able woman was building planes in Seattle. His grandfather had been too old to fight and too stubborn to leave, so he'd bought land and built a house and raised cattle until cattle prices crashed, and he'd switched to horses because horses, he'd said, had more sense than cows and better company. Wade's father had inherited the ranch in 1967 and promptly run it into the ground through a combination of bad luck and worse decisions, drinking away the profit and mortgaging the land until the bank owned more of it than he did. Wade had taken over in 1981 when his father died of a heart attack at 53, and he'd spent the next 10 years digging out of debt the way you dig out of snow, one shovelful at a time, making progress so slow you couldn't see it until you looked back and realized you'd moved. The house came into view as he crested the last hill, a 2-story farmhouse with white siding that needed painting, and a porch that sagged on the north corner where the foundation had settled. Karen had wanted to fix that porch. She'd wanted to paint the house yellow and plant roses and put up window boxes with geraniums. Wade had said they'd do it next year when money was better, and then next year had come and gone and the porch still sagged, and the house was still white and Karen was dead. And the window boxes were just one more thing on a list of things he'd meant to do but hadn't. He parked the truck by the barn and sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, looking at the property like he was seeing it for the first time. 12 horses in various paddocks, most of them rescues he'd taken in over the years because saying no felt too much like giving up. A barn his grandfather had built that was still sound despite 70 years of weather. Fencing that ran along property lines in mostly straight rows. Equipment that worked when it had to. It wasn't much, but it was paid for, or it had been until last year when the feed costs had spiked and the vet bills had piled up and Wade had done what he'd sworn he'd never do and taken out a loan. $42,000 at 8% interest, due in 18 months or the bank could start foreclosure proceedings. Wade had the paperwork in his desk drawer, looked at it every morning like looking at it would make the numbers change. They never did. Numbers were honest that way. They didn't pretend things were better than they were. The barn door was open the way he'd left it, and inside he could hear the horses moving in their stalls, the comfortable sounds of animals waiting for dinner. Wade grabbed a bucket and started measuring grain, moving down the row, each horse getting their portion based on age and weight and need. This was the work he understood, the simple mathematics of keeping things alive. feed and water and shelter, fix what broke, prevent what you could, accept what you couldn't. Chance was in the end stall, a 9-year-old Mustang gelding with a coat the color of smoke and eyes that held too much knowledge for an animal. Wade had gotten him 8 months ago from the Bureau of Land Management Wild Horse Holding Facility, one of 300 horses rounded up from the Montana prairie and destined for auction or worse. Most people wanted young horses, pretty horses, horses that hadn't been traumatized by helicopters and separation, and the sudden violent shift from wild to captive. Chance had been none of those things. He'd been 1,200 pounds of wild-eyed terror, refusing to eat, refusing to be touched, standing in the corner of his pen like he was trying to disappear into the walls. Wade had bought him for $300 and brought him home and spent 6 months earning his trust, one handful of grain at a time, one soft word at a time, one moment of not giving up at a time. It had been Corinne's dream, the rescue work. She'd wanted to expand the ranch, take in more horses, build a reputation as a place where broken things could heal. Wade had said it wasn't practical, wasn't profitable, wasn't worth the risk. And then she died and Wade had started taking in rescues anyway, because doing the thing she'd wanted felt like the only apology he had left to give. Chance took the grain from Wade's hand gently, his muzzle soft against Wade's palm. 8 months ago he wouldn't have let Wade within 10 feet. Now he nickered when Wade approached, pressed his head against Wade's chest when Wade scratched behind his ears, followed him around the paddock like a dog. Healing wasn't linear and it wasn't fast, but it was possible. Wade had to believe that. If horses could heal, maybe people could too. "Good boy," Wade murmured, running his hand down Chance's neck. "You're doing good." The horse's ears flicked forward, attentive. Wade had noticed over the months that Chance was smart in a way that went beyond training, like he understood not just commands but intention, not just words but the space between them. Some horses were like that. Corinne had been like that too, able to read Wade's silences better than his speeches, knowing when he was worried or angry or scared even when he said he was fine. Wade finished the evening feeding and closed up the barn as the sun started its descent behind the Rockies, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that were almost too beautiful to look at directly. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the light change, thinking about Corinne and Claire and the porch that still sagged, and all the things he'd meant to fix but hadn't. The weight of it sat on his chest like a stone, familiar and heavy, and almost comfortable because he'd carried it so long he didn't know who he'd be without it. His phone rang as he was walking back to the house, the sound harsh in the quiet. Wade almost didn't answer. Most calls were spam or bills or people selling things he didn't need. But the screen said Sarah Bennett, and Sarah was the real estate agent who'd helped him buy the ranch supplies lot last year, and Sarah didn't call unless she had a reason. "Wade Hollister," he said, pressing the phone to his ear. "Mr. Hollister, it's Sarah Bennett." Her voice was professionally cheerful but with an undertone Wade couldn't quite place. Tension, maybe, or worry. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "I'm always at a bad time," Wade said, which was true enough. "What do you need?" "Actually, I'm calling because I have something you might need." Papers rustled in the background. "I've got a property listing that just came across my desk this morning. 170 acres, main house, barn, couple of outbuildings. The seller is motivated, very motivated." Wade had learned that motivated was real estate code for desperate, which usually meant there was something wrong with the property that wouldn't show up until after you signed the papers. Still, 170 acres was substantial. His current 80 was cramped with 12 horses and no room to expand. "What's the asking price?" he asked, already doing math in his head about loans he couldn't afford and expansions that would never happen. There was a pause on Sarah's end, long enough that Wade thought the call had dropped. Then she said, $600. Wade stopped walking. 600,000. $600, Sarah repeated, and now he could hear the strain in her voice clearly. Total, for the whole property. He stood in the middle of his driveway, staring at nothing, trying to make the numbers make sense. 170 acres of Montana land should cost somewhere between $40,000 and $70,000, depending on location and condition. $600 was what you paid for a used saddle or a month of grain. It wasn't what you paid for a working ranch. What's wrong with it? Wade asked. Nothing structural, Sarah said quickly, too quickly. The buildings are sound, the land is good grazing land, it's just been empty for a long time, since 1956 actually. She took a breath and Wade heard something in it that sounded like reluctance. The current owner is an elderly woman in a care facility in Billings. She inherited it from her aunt decades ago and never did anything with it. Now she wants it sold before she dies, and she wants it sold fast. Why? Another pause. Mr. Hollister, I need to be honest with you about something. This property has a history, a difficult history. The previous owner's husband disappeared from the property in 1947, just vanished. She lived there alone for 9 years waiting for him to come back. When he didn't, she moved to town and never returned. The house has been empty since 1956. Sarah's voice dropped lower. People say it's haunted. People say there's something wrong with the land. I don't know if I believe in that kind of thing, but I know 3 different buyers have backed out after viewing. They all said the same thing. There's a heaviness there. Wade looked at the house, the barn, the land he'd scraped together and barely held onto. He thought about the $42,000 he owed, the 18 months he had to pay it, the rescue horses he couldn't take in because he didn't have space. He thought about Corinne's dream of a real rescue operation. Where's the property? He asked. About 40 minutes northeast of Great Falls. County Road 47. It's remote, but accessible year-round. I can take you out there tomorrow if you're free. What time? How about 10? I'll meet you at the property. I'll text you the coordinates. Sarah hesitated, then added, Mr. Hollister, I need to tell you something else. This property has personal significance for me. Family history I only recently learned about. I want to be transparent about that before you decide whether to view it. Wade's curiosity sharpened. What kind of family history? It's complicated, Sarah said carefully. I'd rather explain in person if that's all right, but I promise you I'm not trying to hide anything. In fact, the opposite. I think this property needs someone who will uncover the truth, not bury it deeper. Wade agreed and hung up, standing in the gathering darkness with the phone in his hand and the feeling that he'd just made a decision that would either save him or finish what the debt had started. $600. He had $600. Barely, but he had it. The question wasn't whether he could afford it. The question was whether he could afford not to. The next morning came cold and clear, the kind of spring morning that promised warmth by afternoon but delivered frost until noon. Wade drove out before the sun was fully up, following the coordinates Sarah had sent to a dirt road that wound through prairie so empty it looked like the edge of the world. Fence posts marked property lines that seemed arbitrary out here, where the land went on forever in every direction. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, small dark shapes against the endless grass. The sky was so big it made the truck feel like a toy. County Road 47 turned to gravel after 10 miles, then to dirt after another 5. The road wasn't maintained so much as suggested. 2 tire tracks through sage and bunch grass, winding between low hills that blocked the wind and created pockets of silence so complete Wade could hear his own heartbeat. He passed an old grain silo, abandoned and leaning, a collapsed barn that had given up the fight against gravity. This was the Montana that tourists didn't see, the places where people had tried to build lives and failed, and left their failures standing like monuments to hope that hadn't been enough. The property appeared around a bend like something out of a photograph, a cluster of buildings that looked frozen in time. A main house, 2 stories, white paint peeling in long strips to reveal gray wood underneath. A barn, red faded to the color of rust, with a gambrel roof and wide double doors. A smaller outbuilding made of stone, squat and solid, maybe 12 feet square. All of it sitting in a natural bowl between hills, protected from the worst of the wind, positioned to catch the morning sun. Sarah's car was already there, parked by the gate, and Sarah herself stood beside it, arms wrapped around herself despite the heavy jacket she wore. She was in her mid-30s, Wade guessed, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and an expression that held more weight than her years suggested. When she saw Wade's truck, she raised a hand in greeting but didn't smile. Wade parked and got out, taking in the property with the eye of someone who'd spent his whole life evaluating land. The grass was good, thick and healthy, not overgrazed. The fencing was old but intact, wire strung between posts that had weathered decades without falling. A seasonal creek ran along the eastern boundary, dry now but the banks showed water marks from spring runoff. This was good land. This was land worth far more than $600. "Morning," Sarah called, walking over. She didn't offer to shake hands, and Wade noticed her hands were trembling slightly. "What do you think?" "I think something's wrong with it," Wade said, "because there had to be. Land this good didn't sell for nothing unless there was a reason." Sarah nodded slowly. "You're right, but it's not what you probably think." She looked at the house, and Wade saw something complicated in her expression. Sadness, maybe, or shame. "The house is unlocked. Before you go in, I need to tell you something. My name is Sarah Bennett now, but I was born Sarah Webb. My grandfather was Colonel Harrison Webb." Wade waited, sensing there was more. "My grandfather died in 1979, Sarah continued, her voice tight. "I was 5 years old. I remember him as this kind, successful man, war hero, community pillar. I grew up proud of the Webb name." She looked at Wade directly now. "Last month I was going through his estate papers for my grandmother's will. I found things, documents, a journal, things that made me realize my grandfather wasn't who I thought he was." "What kind of things?" "The man who disappeared from this property in 1947 was named Joseph Brennan. My grandfather knew him. They worked together at the Veterans Cooperative Bank, and my grandfather was involved in what happened to him." Sarah's hands were shaking harder now. "I don't know all the details yet, but I know enough to know my family's legacy is built on something rotten, and I can't keep selling this property without telling potential buyers the truth." Wade looked at her, this young woman carrying her grandfather's sins, and saw something he recognized. The weight of inherited guilt. The burden of learning that the people who made you weren't who you thought they were. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because you're the first person who looked at this property and didn't ask to leave immediately. Because something tells me you're the kind of person who doesn't run from hard truths." Sarah met his eyes. "And because if there's something buried here, something that needs to be found, I think you might be the one to find it." Wade walked to the house, leaving Sarah by her car. The front porch groaned under his weight but held. The door opened easily, unlocked like Sarah had said, swinging inward to reveal a living room that looked like someone had walked out in the middle of doing dishes and just never come back. Furniture covered in dust. A calendar on the wall showing March 1956. Newspapers stacked on a side table, yellowed and brittle. Curtains drawn against windows so dirty they barely let in light. Wade walked through slowly, his boots loud on the wooden floors. The kitchen had dishes in the sink, cups and plates waiting to be washed. The dining room table was set for two, plates and silverware positioned like guests were expected any moment. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms, all untouched. In the master bedroom, the bed was made with military precision, a man's work boots sitting at the foot of it like he'd just taken them off. His clothes hung in the closet, shirts and pants on hangers, everything neat and organized and waiting. It was a museum to absence, this house, a shrine to someone who'd left and never returned, maintained by someone who couldn't accept that leaving. Wade felt something tighten in his chest, recognition of a kind of grief he understood too well. This was what happened when you couldn't let go. This was what happened when you kept setting a place at the table for someone who was never coming back to fill it. He went back downstairs and outside, breathing in the clean prairie air like it could wash away the staleness of the house. Sarah was still by her car, watching him with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been shared understanding. "The barn's in better shape than the house," she called. "Structurally sound, roof's good." Wade walked to the barn, pulling open the heavy doors. Inside was dim and cool, the smell of old hay and leather and time. Stalls lined both sides, empty now but well built, with good drainage and solid walls. The loft above still had hay bales, ancient and compressed, probably unusable but proof that someone had once worked this land seriously. Tools hung on the walls, organized by size and function. A tack room in the back still had saddles on stands, bridles on hooks, everything covered in dust but preserved like artifacts. Whoever had owned this place had been a horseman, a serious horseman, someone who took care of their equipment and their animals with the kind of attention that spoke to love as much as necessity. Wade ran his hand along a stall door, feeling the smooth wood worn down by decades of horses leaning against it, rubbing their heads, waiting to be fed. This barn had good bones. This barn could be brought back to life. The stone building was last. It sat apart from the house and barn, maybe 50 yards away, positioned where the land started to slope upward toward the hills. As Wade approached, he noticed the door was heavy wood reinforced with metal straps, and there was a padlock hanging from the latch. The padlock was old, the kind they'd made in the 40s, but the chain that had once held it had rusted through and lay on the ground in pieces. The door opened when Wade pulled it. Inside was a single room, maybe 12 by 12, with a dirt floor and stone walls. Empty, completely empty. No tools, no storage, nothing that would explain why you'd build a stone structure this solid and this separate. The walls were thick, at least 2 feet of stacked stone built to last centuries. The floor was packed earth, hard as concrete from years of settling. There were no windows, no ventilation except the door. It was like a bunker, or a vault, or a place where you'd put something you never wanted found. Wade stood in the doorway, looking at the empty space, and felt that same tightness in his chest he'd felt in the house. Something had happened here. Not supernatural, not ghosts or hauntings or any of that nonsense. Something human, something sad, something that had left an impression on the land the way water leaves marks on rock, slowly, over time, wearing away until the shape of what happened remained even after the event itself was gone. He stepped out and closed the door, turning to find Sarah had walked over, standing a respectful distance away but close enough to talk. "What do you think?" she asked quietly. Wade looked at the property as a whole. 170 acres of good grazing land, buildings that needed work but were fundamentally sound, water rights from the creek, fencing that could be repaired. For $600, this was beyond a bargain. This was practically theft. And that, Wade knew, was exactly the problem. Nothing this good came this cheap unless there was a reason people didn't want it. But Wade had spent 4 years living with something people didn't want to touch. He lived with guilt and regret, and the ghost of a woman who deserved better than what he'd given her. If he could live with that, he could live with whatever shadows this land carried. "I'll take it," Wade said. Sarah's expression shifted, something like relief mixing with apprehension. "You're sure? You've only been here 20 minutes. "How long do I need? It's land, it's buildings. It's exactly what I need for exactly what I can afford. When can we close? The seller wanted a fast transaction, Sarah said slowly, pulling out her phone. I can probably have papers ready this afternoon if you're serious. She's in a care facility in Billings. We could meet there, do the signing, have you out with a deed by tonight. Let's do it, Wade said. Sarah made a call, talked in low tones for a few minutes, then hung up. 3 o'clock. Meadowlark Care Center in Billings. The seller's name is Mary Brennenshaw. Bring $600 cash or cashier's check and an ID. I'll have all the paperwork ready. She paused. Mr. Hollister, I meant what I said earlier. I think this property needs the truth to come out. My grandfather's papers mentioned something about this place, about Joseph Brennan. I don't know what happened here, but I know it was wrong. And I know my family was involved. Why tell me all this? Wade asked. You could have just sold it and walked away. Because I'm tired of living with secrets, Sarah said simply. Because my grandfather lived 74 years as a respected man and died peacefully, and now I know he didn't deserve that peace. Because someone needs to set the record straight, even if it's 67 years late. Wade nodded, understanding that weight, that need to make things right even when making them right changed everything you thought you knew. As he was pulling away, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw Sarah still standing there, phone in hand, looking at the property like she was trying to figure out what had just happened. Wade wondered the same thing. He wondered if he just made the smartest decision of his life or the dumbest. He wondered if there was a difference. The drive to Billings took 90 minutes through prairie that slowly gave way to the city sprawl, ranch land becoming subdivisions, open sky becoming shopping centers and traffic lights, and all the infrastructure of people living on top of each other. Wade got the cashier's check from his bank, watching his account balance drop to almost nothing, then drove to the care facility and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes trying to talk himself out of or into what he was about to do. The Meadowlark Care Center was nice as these places went, all bland colors and soft lighting, and the smell of cleaning products trying to cover the smell of age and sickness and slow decline. The receptionist directed him to a conference room where Sarah was already set up, papers spread across the table in neat stacks. An elderly woman sat in a wheelchair by the window, her hair white and thin, her hands trembling in her lap. A nurse stood behind her, watchful. Mr. Hollister, Sarah said, standing. This is Mary Brennenshaw. Mary, this is Wade Hollister, the buyer. Mary looked at Wade with eyes that were rheumy but sharp, like age had worn away everything except the essential awareness underneath. She didn't smile. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze moving from his face to his hands to his boots and back again, like she was reading something written in him that he couldn't see himself. You're a horseman, she said. Her voice was thin but clear. Yes, ma'am, Wade said. Good, the land needs a horseman. Joseph was a horseman, he would have liked that. Sarah cleared her throat. Shall we go through the paperwork? The transaction took 11 minutes. Sarah explained each document, where to sign, what everything meant. Mary signed with a shaking hand, her signature barely legible. Wade signed below hers, his own handwriting looking too firm, too alive next to her trembling marks. The deed transferred ownership from Mary Brennenshaw to Wade Hollister for the sum of $600, paid in full. No liens, no encumbrances, no warranties beyond the basic legal requirements. When it was done, Sarah gathered the papers and stood to leave, clearly eager to finish this transaction and move on, though Wade could see the conflict in her face, the struggle between wanting to be done with her family's legacy and wanting to understand it. But Mary reached out and caught Wade's sleeve as he was turning to go. Wait, she said, please. Wade stopped. Mary's grip was weak but insistent. Her eyes had gone somewhere else, somewhere distant, and when she spoke again her voice had changed, gotten younger, more urgent. Tell her he didn't leave, Mary said, the words tumbling out fast like she'd been holding them back for years and couldn't contain them anymore. Tell her he tried to come back, the smokehouse. He left something in the smokehouse. She never found it. She died not knowing. Tell her he didn't abandon her. Tell who? Wade asked gently, crouching down so he was at her eye level. Mary blinked and her eyes came back to the present. She looked confused, like she'd woken from a dream and couldn't quite remember where she was. My aunt, she said. Aunt Helen. She lived in that house for 9 years, waiting for him to walk through that door. Everyone says he abandoned her, stole money, started a new life. I refuse to believe it. The nurse touched Mary's shoulder gently. Mary, we talked about this. Your Aunt Helen passed away a long time ago. It's okay. I know she's dead, Mary snapped with sudden sharpness. I'm old, not stupid, but that doesn't mean she doesn't deserve the truth. Somebody should tell her the truth. Wade glanced at Sarah, who was gathering her things and pretending not to hear this. Though he could see her hands had stopped moving, her attention caught. He looked back at Mary, this elderly woman in a care facility selling land for almost nothing and talking about telling truths to people who'd been dead for decades. What's in the smokehouse? Wade asked. Mary's face crumpled. I don't know, I never went there, I was too scared. But Joseph told Aunt Helen before he disappeared. She wrote it in a letter I found after she died. She said he told her if anything happened to him, the truth was where the smoke rises to heaven. She thought he meant church, but he meant the smokehouse. He hid something there, something important. Why didn't anyone look? Because the family boarded the place up in 1956 and nobody's been back since. Because talking about Joseph meant talking about how he vanished and how Aunt Helen went half mad with grief and how the whole thing was just too sad to touch. We're good at that in this family, good at not touching sad things. Mary's hands were shaking harder now. But you're there now. You own it. You can look. You can find what he left. You can know the truth even if it's 67 years too late. The nurse was wheeling Mary toward the door, the visit clearly over. Wade stood there with a deed in his hand and a feeling in his chest like he'd just inherited more than land. I'll look, he called after her. I promise I'll look. Mary turned in her wheelchair, her face suddenly peaceful. Thank you, she said. Joseph was a good man. Whatever happened to him, he was a good man. People should remember that. Then she was gone, wheeled away down a corridor that smelled like disinfectant and last chances. And Wade was left standing in a conference room with Sarah, who was very carefully not asking any questions. That was unusual, Sarah said finally. Which part? All of it. She handed him a folder with his copies of the paperwork. Congratulations, Mr. Hollister. You now own one of the strangest properties in Montana. She hesitated, then added, Joseph Brennan was the man my grandfather knew, the one I mentioned. I don't know what happened between them, but I know my grandfather's papers mention him. Multiple times, with concern, with guilt. You think your grandfather had something to do with his disappearance? I don't know, Sarah said quietly. But I want to know. And if you find anything in that smokehouse, anything that sheds light on what happened, I want you to tell me, even if it destroys what's left of my family's reputation. Wade studied her, this woman choosing truth over comfort, honesty over legacy. Why? Because I'm tired of living in the shadow of lies, Sarah said. Because every time I sell a property or help a client, I wonder if I'm building on the same foundation of dishonesty my grandfather built on. Because I want to be better than him, and being better starts with facing what he did. Wade drove back to his ranch in silence, the deed on the passenger seat, his mind turning over Mary's words and Sarah's confession and the feeling that he'd just stepped into something much larger than a simple land purchase. The smokehouse, something hidden, a truth that had waited 67 years to be found. He told himself it was probably nothing, Old woman with dementia, mixing up memories, giving meaning to things that had none, but he couldn't quite make himself believe it. He got home just as the sun was setting, that magic hour when the light turned everything gold, and the shadows grew long enough to hide in. He fed the horses their evening grain, checked water troughs, did all the small tasks that made up the architecture of his days. And then he loaded Chance into the trailer, because if he was going to look at a mystery, he wanted the horse that had taught him how to be patient with broken things. The drive back to the new property took 40 minutes in gathering darkness. Wade parked by the barn and unloaded Chance, who stepped down from the trailer calmly, looking around at the unfamiliar space with interest rather than fear. 8 months ago this would have been impossible. 8 months ago Chance would have been wild-eyed and trembling. Now he stood quietly, waiting to see what Wade needed from him. "Come on, boy," Wade said, clipping a lead rope to Chance's halter. "Let's see what we bought." They walked toward the house first, Wade wanting to give Chance time to adjust to the new smells and sounds. The horse moved easily beside him, ears forward, attentive but calm. They circled the barn, approached the house, and everything was fine until they got within 30 feet of the stone smokehouse. Chance stopped. Not spooked, not scared, just stopped as suddenly as if he'd hit a wall. His ears went back, then forward, then back again. His nostrils flared, testing the air. Wade felt the horse's muscles tense through the lead rope, that particular quality of tension that meant something was wrong, something Chance could sense that Wade couldn't. "Easy," Wade said softly. "It's just a building." But Chance wasn't buying it. He pulled back against the lead rope, not fighting exactly, more like refusing. Like a child planting their feet and saying, "No, I won't, you can't make me." Wade tried to lead him closer and Chance backed up 3 steps, head high, eyes wide. Then slowly, deliberately, Chance began to walk. Not toward the smokehouse, but around it. A wide circle, maybe 30 paces in diameter with the stone building at the center. The horse moved with purpose, not randomly. 1 step at a time, measuring the distance, keeping the circle even. Wade let him do it, curious now, watching as Chance completed 1 full revolution and then started another. On the second circuit, Chance stopped at a spot on the eastern side of the circle, about halfway between the smokehouse and the property's edge. He lowered his head to the ground and sniffed, that deep investigative sniff horses did when they were trying to understand something. Then he lifted his right front hoof and struck the ground. Not a nervous paw, but a deliberate hit. Once, twice, 3 times. He paused, then did it again. 3 strikes, rhythmic, evenly spaced. Then 2 strikes. Then 1. The pattern repeated. 3 strikes, pause, 3 strikes, pause, 2 strikes, pause, 1 strike, pause. Over and over, precise as a metronome, the horse communicating something Wade couldn't quite grasp. Wade stood there in the fading light, holding the lead rope of a horse who was tapping out a message on ground that had been empty for 67 years, and felt something cold walk down his spine. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. The feeling you get when you're about to learn something you can't unlearn, when you're standing at the edge of a truth that's going to change the shape of everything that comes after. "What do you know, boy?" Wade whispered. "What do you know that I don't?" Chance stopped tapping and looked at him, and Wade would swear later that there was something almost human in that gaze. Something that said, "I'm trying to tell you. I'm trying to show you. Please pay attention." Wade walked Chance back to the trailer and loaded him up, then returned to the smokehouse alone. The door opened easily, no resistance, no horror movie creaking. Inside was the same empty space he'd seen that morning. Dirt floor, stone walls, nothing. He knelt and ran his hands over the ground where Chance had been pawing, feeling for anything unusual. The earth was packed hard, compressed by decades of settling, indistinguishable from any other patch of Montana dirt. He was about to give up when his fingers caught on something. A slight depression in the earth, barely noticeable, maybe a foot in diameter. The kind of settling that happened when soil underneath had been disturbed and never quite compacted back to its original density. Wade pressed down on the spot and felt it give slightly, just a fraction of an inch, like there was a void below. He sat back on his heels, staring at the unremarkable patch of earth, thinking about Mary's words. The smokehouse. Joseph left something in the smokehouse. Thinking about Chance's deliberate pawing, the pattern of strikes, the insistence. Thinking about a man who'd disappeared in 1947 and a woman who'd waited 9 years for him to come home. Wade stood and walked to his truck, pulled a flashlight from the glove box, and shone it on the ground inside the smokehouse from different angles. The depression was clearer in the raking light, a circle of subsidence that suggested something had been buried, and the earth had slowly, over decades, compressed down to fill the space. He should call someone, an archaeologist or the police or someone official who knew about these things. But it was almost 9 at night, and he was alone on property that legally belonged to him now, and the shovel was in his truck and Mary's voice was in his head saying you can know the truth, even if it's 67 years too late. Wade got the shovel. 60 miles away, in a ranch house that sat on land his father had bought with money that had never been entirely explained, Philip Kress couldn't sleep. He'd been having trouble sleeping for a week, ever since he'd found his father's journal in a box in the attic, a journal he'd been looking for estate papers, and found instead a confession to something that changed everything he thought he knew about his family. The journal was leather-bound, old, the pages yellowed and brittle, his father's handwriting distinctive and careful. The entries started in 1947 and continued sporadically until 1981, the year his father died. Philip had read it twice through, hoping he'd misunderstood, hoping there was some other interpretation. But the words were clear. The confession was explicit. March 17, 1947, had to silence Brennan. No choice, he would have ruined everything. Philip sat at his father's old desk with the journal open in front of him and a glass of whiskey in his hand that he wasn't drinking. His father had been a respected man, a pillar of the community, a war veteran, a successful rancher, a member of the church council, and also, apparently, a murderer. The rest of the entries detailed a guilt that had eaten his father alive over 34 years. Remorse and justification tangled together, prayers for forgiveness alternating with explanations for why it had been necessary, why Joseph Brennan had to die, why silence was the only option. The last entry, dated 3 weeks before his father's death from cancer, was simple. God will judge me. I deserve hell. Philip had spent the week trying to decide what to do with this information. Burn the journal and let the dead keep their secrets, or bring it to light and destroy his father's reputation, his family's name, everything they'd built. There was no good choice. There was only choosing which kind of damage to live with. But that afternoon, his phone had rung. A real estate agent named Sarah Bennett, calling about a property on County Road 47 that had just been sold. The old Brennan place. Did Philip know anything about it, she'd asked, because the new owner was a man named Wade Hollister, and he'd seemed very interested in the property's history. Also, Sarah had mentioned, she was Harrison Webb's granddaughter, and she'd found some of her grandfather's papers that suggested connections to the Brennan disappearance and to Philip's father, Martin Kress. Philip had said no, he didn't know anything, thank you for calling, and hung up. And then he'd sat there for an hour, staring at his father's journal, knowing that someone was now living on the land where Joseph Brennan had been killed and buried. Someone who might start asking questions. Someone who might start digging. He looked at his father's journal one more time, at the words that couldn't be taken back, and made a decision. Tomorrow he would drive out to the Brennan property. Tomorrow he would meet this Wade Hollister. Tomorrow he would find out if the past was really buried as deep as his father had thought, or if some truths couldn't stay hidden no matter how many years you piled on top of them. And 60 miles from both of them, in a diner that served the best coffee in Dutton and the strongest gossip in 3 counties, an old rancher named Frank Hollies sat in his usual booth and read about the Brennan property sale in the local real estate listings. Frank was 78 years old now, a WWII veteran who'd served in the Pacific and come home to Montana believing he'd build something good on American soil. Instead, he'd lost everything to a con that had destroyed 13 families and killed at least 3 men. Frank knew what had happened to Joseph Brennan. He'd known for 67 years. He'd kept silent because silence had seemed like survival, and survival had seemed like the only thing that mattered after his wife Sarah died in that car accident in 1947, 3 weeks after Frank had started asking questions about where the co-op money had gone. But Frank was 78 now, and survival didn't seem as important as it used to. Truth seemed important. Justice seemed important. Making sure that before he died, someone knew what Martin Kress and Harrison Webb had done. Frank paid for his coffee and drove home slowly through the Montana twilight, thinking about Joseph Brennan and Helen and the terrible weight of carrying secrets for 67 years. Thinking about the new owner, this Wade Hollister, who'd bought the property for $600 and might be fool enough or brave enough or desperate enough to dig up what needed digging. Tomorrow, Frank decided. Tomorrow he'd drive out there and tell someone, finally, what he'd been too scared to say for most of his life. Tomorrow he'd finish what Joseph Brennan had started in 1947. The truth was coming after 67 years of burial, and everyone who'd touched it was about to find out that some secrets didn't stay buried forever. They just waited for someone willing to dig. The first shovelful of earth came up easy, loose topsoil that hadn't been disturbed in decades but wasn't compacted either. Wade worked by flashlight, the beam casting hard shadows across the smokehouse walls, turning the small stone room into something that felt older than it was, more permanent, like a place that had always existed and always would. The night outside was silent except for the wind moving through grass and the occasional call of a night bird hunting. Wade's breathing was loud in the confined space, his heartbeat louder. 2 feet down, the soil changed, became harder, more resistant, the kind of earth that had been packed deliberately rather than settling naturally over time. Wade slowed, working more carefully now, aware that he was crossing from curiosity into something that felt more like trespass. This wasn't his mystery. These weren't his secrets. But Mary had asked him to look, and chance had insisted in the only way a horse could, and Wade had spent 4 years not looking at things that hurt, so maybe it was time to start. At 3 feet, the shovel hit metal. The sound was distinct, that particular ring of steel on steel that meant something solid underneath. Wade knelt and used his hands to clear away the remaining dirt, fingers finding the edges of a box, brushing away soil grain by grain until he could see what he'd found. A metal lockbox, maybe 18 inches long and a foot wide, the kind banks used in the 40s for important documents. It was wrapped in oilcloth that had deteriorated but still held enough integrity to have protected what was inside. No lock on the box itself, just a simple latch, rusted but functional. Wade sat back on his heels, staring at it. This was the moment. Open the box and learn whatever Joseph Brennan had buried here in 1947, or rebury it and let the dead keep their secrets. He thought about Mary in her wheelchair, trembling hands and urgent voice. Tell her he didn't leave. He thought about Helen Brennan living in that frozen house for 9 years, setting a table for 2, keeping boots by the bed, waiting for a man who would never walk through the door. He opened the box. Inside, wrapped in more oilcloth, were papers. A journal, leather-bound and remarkably preserved. A letter, sealed in an envelope that had yellowed but remained intact. And underneath everything, a small notebook filled with numbers, columns of figures in neat handwriting, dates and amounts and initials that meant nothing to Wade but had clearly meant everything to whoever wrote them. Wade took the journal out first, carefully, treating it like the fragile thing it was. The leather cover had a name embossed on it, worn almost smooth but still legible in the flashlight beam. Joseph Brennan, 1947. Wade opened it to the first page and read the opening line. If you're reading this, then I'm either dead or too much of a coward to do what needs doing, and either way, someone needs to know the truth. Wade read the entire journal sitting on the dirt floor of the smokehouse, his back against the stone wall, the flashlight propped on the lockbox. Joseph Brennan's handwriting was neat and careful, the penmanship of someone educated in an era when handwriting mattered. The entries were dated, starting in January 1947 and ending in March of the same year, a 3-month chronicle of a man drowning in guilt and trying to find his way back to shore. Joseph had been a sheep rancher, the journal said. Came back from the war in North Africa in 1945 with medals and trauma and a dream of building something solid on Montana land. He'd bought this property in 1946 with money he'd saved and money he'd borrowed and a promise to his dying father that he'd make something of the Brennan name. The ranch had been struggling. Drought and predators, and the simple hard math of trying to make a living from animals that died too easily and sold for too little. In the fall of 1945, Joseph had been elected treasurer of the Veterans Cooperative Bank, a small institution set up by returning soldiers to help each other get established. The co-op held the savings of 37 families, modest amounts mostly, but everything to the people who deposited it. Joseph had access to the funds. Joseph had a ranch on the edge of failure. Joseph had made a choice he couldn't take back. The journal entry for November 1945 was brief and devastating. Borrowed $47,000 from the co-op today. Will pay it back as soon as the ranch turns around. Just need to get through winter. Just need to buy time. God forgive me. But the ranch hadn't turned around. Spring 1946 brought more losses, more expenses, more debt piling on debt. And Joseph had kept the embezzlement hidden, adjusting ledgers, creating false entries, living with the weight of what he'd done pressing on his chest every time he looked at Helen, every time he rode his land that was bought with stolen money, every time he saw other veterans in town and knew he'd betrayed them. Then in January 1947, everything changed. The co-op's other administrator, a man named Martin Kress, had come to Joseph's ranch late one night. The journal entry describing that visit was longer, more detailed, written with the urgency of someone who needed to get the words out before they suffocated him. Martin knows. He figured out what I did. I thought I was finished, thought he'd turn me in, and I was almost relieved because living with this secret is killing me slower than prison would. But Martin didn't come to turn me in. He came to tell me he's been doing the same thing. He's taken $120,000 over the past year. He said we're partners now whether we like it or not. He said if one of us goes down, we both go down. He said we can fix this together, cover our tracks, make the books balance, and nobody ever has to know. I said yes. God help me, I said yes because I was scared and weak and I couldn't face Helen with the truth of what I'd done. But I can't sleep anymore. I can't eat. I can't look at myself in a mirror without seeing a thief and a coward looking back. The later entries chronicled Joseph's descent into something that wasn't quite a breakdown but wasn't far from it. Sleepless nights, weight loss, an inability to concentrate on anything but the growing certainty that he couldn't live this way. He wrote about Helen, page after page about Helen, how she trusted him completely, how she believed in him, how she deserved better than a husband who'd stolen from their friends and lied to her face every day for a year and a half. The entry dated March 10th, 1947 was the turning point. I've made my decision. I'm confessing. Not to Martin because Martin will just talk me out of it again. I'm confessing to everyone. I'm calling a meeting of the co-op members for March 18th. I'm going to tell them everything I did, offer to give them the ranch to sell, pay back what I can. I'll go to prison if they want. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. I told Martin tonight. He begged me not to, said it would destroy both of us, destroy our families. I said some things are already destroyed and hiding it just makes it worse. He left angry. I don't care. I'm done being scared. I'm done lying to Helen. 10 more days and this will be over. The final entry was dated March 17th, the day before the planned confession. It was written to Helen. My dearest Helen, by the time you read this, you'll know what I've done. You'll know I stole money and lied to you and failed at being the man you deserved. I'm so sorry. I'm sorrier than I have words to say. I love you more than my own life, and that's why I have to do this. I can't keep poisoning our marriage with secrets. I can't keep looking at you and knowing I'm not worthy of how you look at me. Tomorrow I confess. Tomorrow I try to make it right, even though I know right is probably impossible now. If they send me to prison, wait for me if you can. If you can't, I understand. You deserve a better man than I turned out to be. But I love you. I will always love you. And I'm trying, even this late, to be the man you believed I was. Wade closed the journal and sat in the silence of the smokehouse, feeling the weight of Joseph's words settling into his bones. A man who'd made one terrible choice and then spent months drowning in the consequences, trying to find the courage to surface and face what he'd done. A man who'd loved his wife enough to risk everything to stop lying to her. A man who'd written that final entry and then vanished the next day before he could deliver it. Wade thought about his own letter that he'd never written, the words he'd never said. I'm sorry I wasn't there, Corinne. I'm sorry I chose fence posts over holding your hand. I'm sorry I thought I had time when time was the one thing you didn't have. The parallel was so clear it hurt. Joseph had run out of time to make things right. Wade had too. The only difference was Wade was still alive to carry the weight of it. He picked up the sealed envelope, the one marked simply Helen in Joseph's handwriting. This letter had been waiting 67 years to be delivered to a woman who died not knowing it existed. Wade broke the seal carefully, unfolding paper that crackled with age, and read words written by a dead man to a dead woman, a conversation that had never happened, a truth that had arrived 7 decades too late. Helen, my love, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I pray you found this quickly, that you didn't spend years wondering. I buried this in the smokehouse because I told you once, remember, that if anything ever happened to me, the truth would be where smoke rises to heaven. I meant this place. I meant here. I've hidden my confession in this box and my evidence in this letter. I need you to know I didn't run away. I didn't abandon you. If I'm gone, it's because someone stopped me, probably Martin, because he has too much to lose if I talk. I love you, Helen. I have loved you since we were 17 years old, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond. Wait for me if you can. But if you can't, know this. You were the best part of my life. You were the only thing I ever did completely right. Wade folded the letter and put it back in its envelope, his hands not quite steady. Helen had never found this. She'd lived 9 years in that house. 9 years of waiting and searching and slowly breaking under the weight of not knowing, and the truth had been 50 yards from her front door the whole time, buried in a place she hadn't understood was significant. The tragedy wasn't just that Joseph had died. The tragedy was that Helen had died too, without ever knowing he tried to come back to her. The notebook was last. Wade opened it and saw columns of numbers, dates, amounts, initials. It took him a few minutes to understand what he was looking at, and when he did, it was like watching a crime unfold in reverse. This was evidence. Joseph's meticulous record of every dollar he'd taken from the co-op, every false entry he'd made in the official ledgers, every lie he'd told to cover his theft, and next to his own crimes in different ink were Martin Cress's. Larger amounts, more frequent withdrawals, a systematic looting of the bank that dwarfed what Joseph had done. Joseph had documented everything, not to protect himself, but to make sure that when he confessed, the full truth came out. He was going to burn his own life down, but he was going to take Martin with him. That's what had gotten him killed, not the confession itself, but the fact that his confession would expose Martin too. Wade packed everything back in the lockbox carefully, wrapped it in his jacket, and carried it out of the smokehouse. The night air felt clean after the closeness of the stone room, cold and sharp and real. Chance was in the trailer, resting but alert, and when Wade approached, the horse nickered softly, that low sound horses make when they're checking in, making sure their person is okay. "I found it, boy," Wade said, reaching through the trailer bars to scratch Chance's forehead. "I found what Joseph left, but I don't know what to do with it." The drive back to his ranch was long and dark and full of thoughts that circled without landing. Wade kept thinking about Joseph's journal, about the months of guilt, about the decision to confess even knowing it would destroy everything. That kind of courage didn't come easy. That kind of honesty cost more than most people were willing to pay. Joseph had been willing to pay it. He'd been murdered for the willingness, killed by a man who valued his own comfort more than the truth. Wade got home past midnight and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the lockbox on his dresser like a presence in the room. He kept thinking about the parallel between his life and Joseph's, both of them carrying guilt that ate at them, both of them knowing they needed to speak truth but terrified of the cost. The difference was Joseph had found his courage. Joseph had decided to confess. And Wade was still 4 years into his silence, still visiting Corinne's grave with apologies, instead of telling his daughter the truth about the day her mother died. Sleep didn't come. At 4 in the morning, Wade gave up and drove back to the Brennan property, because if he was going to carry this mystery, he needed to understand it completely. He needed to see the house again, the place where Helen had waited, the shrine she'd built to a man who never came home. Dawn was just starting to break when Wade pulled up to the property, the sky going from black to gray to that particular shade of pale blue that meant sunrise was coming but hadn't arrived yet. The house looked different in this light, less haunted and more just sad, a structure that had been loved once and then abandoned when the love that sustained it died. Wade went inside, moving through rooms he'd only glanced at before, paying attention now to the details. The living room had photographs on the mantel, black and white images of a young couple smiling at the camera. Joseph and Helen on their wedding day, both of them impossibly young, faces full of a future they thought they'd have. Joseph in his army uniform, looking serious and proud. Helen in a teaching dress, standing in front of a classroom of children. A whole life captured in frames, frozen at the moment before everything fell apart. The kitchen still had dishes in the sink, and Wade understood now why Helen had left them. She'd made breakfast for 2 on March 17, 1947, expecting Joseph to come home that evening. When he didn't, she'd left the dishes because washing them would mean accepting he wasn't coming. So they'd sat for 9 years, and then for another 58 after that, waiting for hands that would never touch them. Upstairs in the bedroom, Wade opened the closet and found Joseph's clothes still hanging. Work shirts, Sunday shirts, a suit that had probably been worn to church and weddings. Helen had kept them like relics, unable to pack them away because packing them away would mean accepting he was gone. On the dresser was a brush with a few strands of dark hair still caught in the bristles. 67-year-old hair from a man who'd been dead almost that long. Wade sat on the bed and felt the springs creak under his weight. This was where Helen had slept alone for 9 years, probably on her side, leaving his side of the bed empty in case he came back. This was where she'd woken up every morning to remember all over again that he was gone. The grief in this house wasn't supernatural. It was just human. It was just the accumulated weight of someone loving so hard and so faithfully that even death couldn't convince them to let go. He found Helen's diary in the nightstand drawer, a leather journal similar to Joseph's but filled with a different kind of pain. Helen's handwriting was neat and controlled, a teacher's handwriting, each letter formed carefully even when the words themselves were breaking apart. Wade sat on the bed and read through years of waiting. March 18, 1947. Joseph didn't come home last night. His truck was found by the river but no sign of him. They're saying he drowned, but I don't believe it. Joseph is a strong swimmer. Something else happened. Something wrong. April 3, 1947. The sheriff says I need to accept that Joseph is gone. They found no body, no evidence of foul play, just an abandoned truck. But Joseph wouldn't leave me. He wouldn't. Not without a word, not without goodbye. June 12, 1947. People in town are starting to talk, saying Joseph ran away, saying he stole money from the bank and fled. I don't believe it. I know my husband. He would never steal. He would never run. The entries went on, month after month, Helen's certainty slowly eroding but never quite breaking. She searched. She hired private investigators with money she didn't have. She talked to every person who'd seen Joseph that day, trying to piece together his last hours. She refused to believe the stories about embezzlement. Even when the Veterans Co-op Bank failed in 1948, and investigators found significant amounts missing and Joseph's name was the only one associated with the discrepancies. Martin Kress had been smarter about covering his tracks, or maybe just luckier. The official investigation concluded that Joseph Brennan had stolen approximately $47,000 and fled, probably to Canada or Mexico, leaving his wife and his responsibilities behind. Case closed. Helen had lived with that verdict for 9 years, watching people in town look at her with pity or suspicion, the wife of a thief who'd been too naive or too stubborn to see what her husband really was. The later entries were harder to read. December 25, 1951. Fifth Christmas alone. Set the table for two again. I'm starting to forget what his voice sounded like. That scares me more than anything. March 17, 1954. 7 years today. 7 years of waiting. 7 years of people telling me to move on. But how do you move on when you don't know? How do you bury someone when there's no body? How do you stop loving someone just because they're gone? January 1, 1956. New Year. I can't do this anymore. I can't live in this house with his ghost. I can't keep setting a table for two. I can't keep wearing my wedding ring and believing he's coming back. But I can't take it off either. So I'm leaving. I'm leaving the house exactly as it is, everything in place just in case. Just in case I'm wrong and he does come back. Just in case miracles still happen. The final entry was dated March 15, 1956. I'm leaving tomorrow. The house is ready, frozen in time, a monument to waiting. I'm leaving a letter for whoever finds this place someday. I'm leaving the truth that no one believes. Joseph didn't run. Joseph didn't steal, or if he did, he had a reason. Joseph loved me. I know that the way I know the sun rises. Love that real doesn't just disappear. If you find this, if you ever understand what happened, please know, I never stopped believing in him. I never stopped loving him. And if there's a heaven, I hope he's there waiting for me the way I waited for him. Wade closed the diary and found the letter Helen had mentioned, tucked in the back pages. It was addressed to whoever finds this, and it said exactly what Mary had told him. The place where smoke rises to heaven. Helen had thought it meant church, had searched there, had prayed there, had never understood that Joseph was being literal. The smokehouse. The place where smoke rose to heaven. The place where he'd hidden his truth. Wade went back downstairs and stood in the kitchen, looking at those dishes in the sink, and felt something break open in his chest. Helen had died in 1956, Mary had said. That meant she'd lived another 4 years after leaving this house, 4 years of carrying the weight of not knowing, 4 years of being called the wife of a thief and a coward, 4 years of loving a man everyone told her wasn't worth loving. And she died without ever learning that Joseph had tried to tell her the truth. She died without knowing that his last written words were, "I love you. Wait for me. I'm trying to make it right." Wade pulled out his phone and called Claire. It was 6 in the morning, too early, but he couldn't wait. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice thick with sleep and worry. "Dad, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Wade said, and his voice cracked on the words because everything was wrong and had been wrong for 4 years. "I need to tell you something, about the day your mom died." There was silence on the other end. Then Claire said, "Okay." "The hospital called at 2:15. They said come now. I was working on the south fence. I told them I'd be there in an hour because I wanted to finish the fence line. Your mom died at 3:02. I got there at 3:12. If I'd left when they called, if I'd dropped everything and run, I would have made it. She wouldn't have died alone." More silence. Wade could hear Claire breathing, could picture her sitting up in bed, processing this, trying to figure out what to say. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked finally. "Because I've been lying to you for 4 years. Letting you think it was just bad timing, just bad luck. But it wasn't. It was a choice. I chose finishing a fence over being with her, and I've been too ashamed to tell you." "Dad," Claire's voice was careful, the way you talk to someone standing on a ledge. "I already knew." Wade felt the world tilt. "What?" "The hospital told me. The nurse who called you, she called me after. She said she'd told you it was urgent and you said you needed an hour. She was upset about it. She thought I should know." "You knew." Wade couldn't make his mind work around it. "You knew and you never said anything." "What was I supposed to say? You were already broken. You were already drowning in guilt. Telling you I knew would have just made it worse." Claire's voice was softer now, sad instead of angry. "I was angry for a long time. I'm not going to lie about that, but I also understood. You were scared. You didn't want it to be real. You thought if you finished the fence first, somehow that would make the call less urgent, would make it not true." "I should have been there," Wade said. And he was crying now, sitting in a dead woman's kitchen surrounded by 67-year-old dishes, crying for his wife and Joseph Brennan, and everyone who'd run out of time before they could say the things that mattered. "I know," Claire said, "but you're here now, that counts for something." They talked for an hour, the longest conversation they'd had in years. Wade told her about the property he'd bought, about Joseph and Helen, about the lockbox and the journal and the terrible parallel between someone else's tragedy and his own. Claire listened without judging, without trying to fix it, just being present in a way she hadn't been since Corinne died. "What are you going to do with all of it?" Claire asked. "The evidence, the journal, all of it." "I don't know yet," Wade said, "but I think I need to find out what really happened to Joseph. He tried to do the right thing. He tried to tell the truth. Someone stopped him. And Helen died not knowing any of it. That feels like something that needs to be finished." "Do you want help?" Claire asked. "I can take some time off work, drive up." Wade looked around the kitchen, at the house that Helen had left frozen in time, at the life that had been interrupted mid-sentence and never resumed. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I'd like that." After they hung up, Wade went back to the smokehouse and stood where he'd dug up the lockbox, looking at the empty hole like it might offer answers. Chance was still in the trailer, patient in the way horses were patient, accepting whatever strange human behavior Wade needed to engage in. Wade walked over and opened the trailer, let the horse out to graze on the good grass that grew around the property. Chance moved immediately to the spot where he'd been pawing the night before, that place 30 paces from the smokehouse where the ground was slightly depressed. He lowered his head and started the pattern again. 3 strikes with his hoof. Pause, 3 strikes, 2 strikes, 1 strike. Over and over, precise and deliberate. Wade watched, counting the strikes, timing the pauses, and something clicked in his brain. Not random, not just nervous energy or animal instinct. A pattern, a code. 3 strikes, pause, 3 strikes, pause, 2 strikes, pause, 1 strike, pause. Wade had learned Morse code in high school, a brief unit in history class about World War II communication. He'd forgotten most of it, but the basics stuck. 3 long sounds was the letter O, 3 short was S, but these weren't quite long or short. They were all the same duration. Just the number of strikes that mattered. 3, 3, 2, 1. Wade knelt and put his hands on the ground where Chance was pawing. The earth was compressed here too, the same kind of settling he'd felt in the smokehouse. And this was outside the building, in the open, 30 paces away. Which meant if something was buried in the smokehouse, something else was buried here. Wade looked at Chance, at the horse who'd been trying to tell him something from the moment they'd arrived, and understood. This wasn't about the smokehouse alone. This was about the property itself. This land held more than one secret, and Chance, somehow, through some instinct Wade couldn't explain and didn't need to, knew where they all were. He went back to his truck and got the metal detector he kept for finding lost fence staples and old equipment. When he passed it over the spot where Chance had been digging, the detector screamed. Something metal, something substantial, buried 3 or 4 feet down. Wade didn't dig. Not yet. Because if there was something here, something important enough to bury, something that had been hidden for 67 years, then it deserved more than one person with a shovel making decisions in the dark. This was bigger than him now. This was Joseph and Helen's story, and it needed to be told right. He loaded Chance back in the trailer and drove to town, to the Cascade County Library in Great Falls, where they kept newspaper archives going back to the founding. The librarian was a woman in her 60s, with reading glasses on a chain, and the efficient manner of someone who'd spent 40 years helping people find information they didn't quite know how to ask for. "I'm researching a missing person case from 1947, Wade told her. Joseph Brennan disappeared from his ranch in March of that year. The librarian's expression shifted, something between recognition and discomfort. "I remember that name. My grandmother knew the family, said it was the saddest thing she'd ever seen, what happened to Helen Brennan." She led Wade to the microfiche machines and pulled up the March 1947 editions of the Great Falls Tribune. The story was there, exactly as Helen's diary had described it. Local rancher missing. Joseph Brennan, 41, disappeared after leaving home on the evening of March 17th. His truck was found abandoned near the Yellowstone River, keys in the ignition, no sign of struggle. Authorities suspected accidental drowning. A body was never recovered. Follow-up articles detailed the search efforts, Helen's pleas for help, the community rallying briefly and then losing interest when weeks passed with no new developments. And then in August 1948, a different kind of article. Veterans Cooperative Bank closes amid scandal. Investigation reveals significant funds missing. Treasurer Joseph Brennan, still missing, believed responsible for embezzlement of at least $47,000. The article quoted Martin Kress, the co-op's administrator, expressing shock and betrayal. "Joseph was my friend. I trusted him completely. I never suspected he was stealing from the very veterans we were trying to help. This is a betrayal of everything we fought for." Wade stared at those words, at Martin's carefully crafted lie, and felt anger kindle hot in his chest. Martin had known. Martin had been stealing too, stealing more than Joseph, and when Joseph had threatened to expose them both, Martin had stopped him. permanently. And then Martin had lived another 34 years, respected and wealthy, letting the world believe Joseph was the only thief, letting Helen die thinking her husband was a coward who'd run away. "Did you find what you needed?" the librarian asked. "I found enough to know I need to find more," Wade said. "What happened to Martin Kress? Is he still alive?" "Martin? No, he died back in 1981. His son Philip runs the family ranch now, the Kress Place, about 60 miles northeast of here. They're good people, well respected." Wade thanked her and left, his mind working through what he knew and what he needed to prove. He had Joseph's confession, Joseph's evidence of dual embezzlement. He had Helen's diary, her years of faithful waiting. He had a house frozen in time and a letter that was 67 years late. He had a horse that somehow knew where secrets were buried. And he had a metal detector screaming over a patch of ground that shouldn't hold anything but dirt. What he didn't have was proof of what had happened to Joseph. A confession in a buried box wasn't enough. The newspaper articles and Helen's diary established that Joseph had disappeared, but not how or why or at whose hands. As Wade was walking back to his truck, he noticed an old Ford pickup parked nearby, and leaning against it was a man who had to be pushing 80, weathered face and work-worn hands and eyes that had seen too much and carried it all anyway. The man was watching Wade, and when their eyes met, he pushed off from the truck and walked over. "You're the one who bought the Brennan place," the man said. "Not a question." "Wade Hollister," Wade said, offering his hand. "Frank Hollies." The handshake was firm despite the age. "I knew Joseph Brennan, served with him in the Pacific, came home and pooled our money into the Veterans Co-op with 11 other families. Joseph was treasurer, best man I knew." Frank's jaw tightened. "Until everyone said he stole from us and ran." Wade felt something click into place. "You were one of the co-op members." "I lost my life savings, $3,000, which was everything I had in 1947. My wife Sarah and we were going to buy a house in town with that money. Instead, we lost it all. Sarah died 3 weeks later." Frank's voice went flat. "Car accident," they said. "Brake line failed." But Sarah had been asking questions about where the money went. She'd been asking Martin Kress some pointed questions, and then her brakes failed. "You think Martin killed her?" "I think Martin killed anyone who threatened to expose what he'd done." Frank pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, yellowed and creased from years of carrying. "This is a list of the 13 families in the co-op. 3 of the men disappeared in March 1947, same week as Joseph. Joseph, Thomas Reeves, Henry Martinez. 3 men who knew the books who would have noticed discrepancies. All gone within 5 days. Wade stared at the list, understanding blooming cold in his chest. Martin didn't just kill Joseph. Martin killed anyone who got in his way, and then he lived 54 more years as a respected rancher and died peacefully in his sleep. Frank's hands were shaking, 67 years of suppressed rage finally finding voice. "I've kept quiet all this time because I was scared, because I had a daughter to raise after Sarah died and I couldn't risk ending up in a ditch somewhere. But I'm 78 years old now. My daughter's grown. And before I die, someone needs to know the truth about what Martin Kress did." "Why tell me?" "Because you're digging. Sarah Bennett called me yesterday, said someone bought the Brennan place and was asking questions. She said you seemed like someone who wouldn't let things lie." Frank looked Wade in the eye. "I can't prove Martin killed my wife. I can't prove he killed Thomas and Henry. But I can tell you Joseph was my friend, and he was planning to confess, and he told me so 2 days before he disappeared. He said he was going to make things right no matter what it cost him. And then he was gone, and Martin was the only one left standing." Wade thought about Joseph's journal, about the entry where he'd told Martin about his plan to confess, about how Martin had begged him not to, about how angry Martin had been when Joseph refused to back down. I found Joseph's journal, Wade said quietly. Buried on the property. He documented everything. His embezzlement, Martin's, the whole thing. He was going to expose them both. Frank closed his eyes and tears leaked from the corners. Then he died for doing the right thing, and Helen died believing he'd abandoned her, and Martin got away with it all. Not anymore, Wade said. I'm going to finish what Joseph started. I'm going to tell the truth, all of it. Frank gripped Wade's arm, surprising strength in those old fingers. Be careful. Martin's dead, but his son Philip runs an empire built on blood money. People with that much to lose don't always let the truth come easy. Wade nodded and watched Frank drive away, this old veteran who'd carried secrets and survivor's guilt for 67 years, finally unburdening himself to a stranger because the weight had become too much to carry alone. Wade understood that weight. He'd been carrying his own version for 4 years. The difference was Wade still had time to make things right. Joseph hadn't. Frank's wife Sarah hadn't. The 3 other missing veterans hadn't. But their stories could still be told. Their truth could still surface. And Wade was going to make sure it did, even if it took the rest of his life and destroyed whatever remained of the Kress family's reputation. He drove back to his ranch with the lockbox on the passenger seat and Frank's words echoing in his head. The sun was setting by the time he got home, painting the sky in shades of fire, and Wade stood in his driveway looking at land he'd barely held onto and thought about how 67 years could pass and truth could still be waiting, patient and persistent, for someone willing to dig it up. Tomorrow he would call Sarah Bennett and tell her what he'd found. Tomorrow he would decide whether to contact authorities or the media or just start digging where chance had indicated and see what other bodies the land had been hiding. Tomorrow he would take the next step in finishing what Joseph had started. But tonight he stood in the gathering dark and thought about all the people who'd been silenced, all the truths that had been buried, all the weight that people like Frank Hollies and Helen Brennan and Joseph himself had carried because someone had valued money more than human life. And Wade made a promise to the dead and the living both. The truth was coming out, every last piece of it, no matter what it cost, no matter who it destroyed. Because some debts transcended death, and some silences needed to be broken, and Wade Hollister was done with hiding from hard truths. The digging was about to begin in earnest, and this time he wasn't going to stop until every secret was exposed and every lie was answered, and every person who'd suffered for someone else's greed finally got the justice they deserved for 67 years. Wade called Sarah Bennett before sunrise, the sky still dark except for a thin line of gray on the eastern horizon. She answered on the second ring, voice alert, like she'd been awake waiting. "Mr. Hollister." "I found it," Wade said without preamble. The lockbox Joseph buried in the smokehouse, his journal, his confession, everything. Sarah, your grandfather was involved. Martin Kress and Harrison Webb both. They were covering up embezzlement, and when Joseph threatened to expose them, they killed him. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Wade thought the call had dropped. Then Sarah's voice came back, small and broken. "I was afraid of that. My grandfather's papers, the ones I found last month, they referenced Joseph multiple times, and Martin Kress. They were working together on something. I just didn't know what." "Can you meet me at the property?" Wade asked. "There's more. My horse Chance, he's been pawing at a spot on the ground. Metal detector says there's something buried there, something big. I think it might be Joseph's body." Another long pause. "You're going to dig it up?" "I am, but I wanted you to know first. This is going to destroy your grandfather's reputation. Everything people believed about Harrison Webb is going to change." "Good," Sarah said, and there was steel in her voice now. "He deserves to have his reputation destroyed. If he helped murder Joseph Brennan, if he helped cover it up for 67 years, then the world needs to know what kind of man he really was. Even if it hurts you, even if it damages your business, your family name. Especially then, Sarah said. I'm tired of benefiting from his crimes. I'm tired of selling property and smiling at clients and pretending my family's legacy is something to be proud of. If the Webb name needs to die, so be it. At least it'll die honestly. Wade gave her directions and hung up, then made 2 more calls. One to Claire, who said she was already packing and would be there by noon. One to the Cascade County Sheriff's Office, where he left a message saying he'd found possible human remains on his property and would they please send someone out to investigate. By the time the sun was fully up, Wade was back at the Brennan property with Chance, a shovel, and a resolve that felt harder than the Montana ground. Sarah arrived first, driving too fast, parking in a spray of gravel. She got out looking like she hadn't slept, eyes red-rimmed and fierce, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt instead of her usual professional attire. "Show me," she said. Wade led her to the spot where Chance had been pawing, 30 paces from the smokehouse in a slight depression where the grass grew differently than the surrounding prairie. Sarah knelt and put her hands on the ground, fingers splayed, like she was trying to feel what was underneath through soil and time and 67 years of burial. "My grandfather died when I was 5, Sarah said quietly. I remember him as this kind man who smelled like pipe tobacco and gave me silver dollars. I grew up believing he was a hero, war veteran, community leader, successful businessman. Everything I am, everything I've built, it's on the foundation of his reputation." She looked up at Wade, eyes wet. "And now I know that foundation is rotten, that he was a murderer, that every success I've had is stained by what he did." "You're not responsible for his crimes," Wade said. "No, but I benefited from them. My college education, my business, the clients who trust me because of my family name, all of it came from wealth he built on murder and theft. How do I live with that? How do I look at myself in the mirror knowing my whole life is a lie?" Wade thought about his own guilt, the 4 years of carrying the weight of not being there when Karen died, the way that guilt had shaped every decision he'd made since. You live with it by making it right. You can't change what he did, but you can choose what you do now. You can choose truth over comfort, justice over reputation. Sarah nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "Then let's dig." They'd been working maybe 20 minutes when a truck pulled up, and Wade recognized it from the day before. Frank Hollies got out, moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose body hurt more than he let on. He walked over to where Wade and Sarah were digging and looked down into the hole they'd started. "Figured you might need a witness," Frank said. "Someone who was there in 1947, someone who knew Joseph." He looked at Sarah. "And you must be Harrison Webb's granddaughter, Sarah Bennett. Your grandfather and my wife were acquainted, right before she died in that convenient car accident." Sarah's face went white. "I'm so sorry, I didn't know." Nobody knew. That was the point. Keep everyone scared, keep everyone silent, and the truth stays buried. Frank picked up a shovel. "But we're done being silent now, so let's finish this." Claire arrived as they hit 3 feet deep, the earth getting harder, darker, changing texture in ways that suggested human interference decades old. She stood at the edge of the hole watching her father work, then climbed down and took a shovel from Sarah. "You're my dad," Claire said simply. "If you're digging, I'm digging." By the time they hit 4 feet, the sun was high and hot, and all 4 of them were sweating through their shirts, dirt under their nails and in their hair and ground into their skin. That's when Wade's shovel hit something that wasn't dirt. He knelt and used his hands to clear away soil, and his fingers found fabric. Deteriorated but still present, beneath the fabric bone. "God," Sarah whispered, "it's really him." They excavated carefully after that, working slowly, treating what they'd found with the reverence you give the dead even when they're strangers, even when they've been gone so long they're more idea than person. The skeleton was mostly intact, laid on its back, arms at its sides. Clothing had rotted away to almost nothing, but enough remained to see that whoever this had been, they'd been buried in regular clothes, not prepared for burial, not treated with any ceremony. Just put in the ground and covered up, hidden away like trash. Wade was clearing dirt from the skull when he found the bullet hole. A clean puncture in the back of the cranium, exit wound in the front, the kind of injury that killed instantly and left no doubt about cause of death. Shot from behind, execution style, by someone the victim had trusted enough to turn his back on. He never saw it coming, Frank said, his voice breaking. Joseph trusted Martin enough to turn his back and Martin shot him. Wade didn't answer. He was staring at the skeleton's left hand, at the ring that still circled the bone of the fourth finger. A simple gold band, dulled by time and soil but still intact, still there after 67 years of being buried. He worked it loose carefully, the metal sliding off bone that had nothing left to hold it, and held it in his palm. There was an inscription on the inside, worn but readable. Helen and Joseph forever, 1932. Wade's throat closed up. This was proof. This was confirmation of everything they'd suspected, and more than they'd wanted to find. Joseph Brennan had been murdered on March 17, 1947, shot in the back by someone he'd thought was his friend, buried in a shallow grave on his own land, and left there for 67 years while his wife waited and searched and died not knowing. The ring was still on his finger because Helen had put it there 15 years earlier, and death and murder and decades in the ground hadn't been enough to remove it. Sarah was crying openly now, sobs that shook her whole body. My grandfather did this. My grandfather helped murder this man and then lived 67 more years like nothing happened, like Joseph wasn't buried here, like Helen wasn't waiting. Claire put her arm around Sarah, this woman she'd just met, offering comfort that transcended the complicated tangle of their family's histories. Your grandfather made his choices. You're making yours. They're different. That matters. A sheriff's cruiser pulled up, followed by a medical examiner's van, and the property suddenly filled with official vehicles and people with badges and authority. They cordoned off the excavation site, photographed everything, treated it like the crime scene it had been 67 years ago. Wade gave them Joseph's journal and evidence ledger. Frank gave a statement about the co-op, about the missing money, about his wife's convenient death and the 3 other veterans who disappeared the same week as Joseph. Sarah gave them her grandfather's papers, the ones she'd found in his estate, documents that showed Harrison Webb and Martin Kress had been business partners in ventures that extended well beyond the veterans' co-op. Real estate deals, mining rights, land speculation, all of it funded with money that had never been adequately explained. All of it suddenly looking like the proceeds of theft and murder. The sheriff, a woman in her 50s named Morrison, read through everything with an expression that went from skeptical to stunned to something like anger. This is a lot to process, she said finally. We're going to need statements from all of you. We'll need to verify everything, and we'll need to decide how to handle this publicly. Handle it truthfully, Wade said. Joseph Brennan was murdered. His wife died not knowing. They both deserve to have the record set straight. Morrison nodded slowly. I agree, but I need you to understand that this is going to be news. National news, probably. Murder solved after 67 years, prominent families implicated, the whole thing. The media is going to descend on this place like locusts. Let them, Sarah said. My grandfather's dead. His reputation dying too is the least he deserves. A second truck arrived. this one driving slowly like the driver wasn't sure they should be there. When it parked, a man in his mid-60s got out, salt and pepper hair and weathered face and shoulders that curved inward like he was trying to make himself smaller. He walked toward the excavation site, then stopped when he saw the official vehicles, the crime scene tape, the skeleton being carefully documented by forensic technicians. "Philip Kress," Frank said, recognition sharp in his voice. The man nodded. "I got a call from Sarah Bennett yesterday. She said someone bought the Brennan property and was asking questions. She said there might be evidence of what happened to Joseph." He looked at the grave, at the remains being photographed and measured. "I found my father's journal a week ago, his confession. I know what Martin Kress did. I know he murdered Joseph Brennan." Philip reached into his truck and pulled out a leather-bound book, old and worn. He handed it to Sheriff Morrison. "This is my father's diary. He kept it for 34 years after Joseph died. Every detail of the murder, every rationalization, every prayer for forgiveness he didn't deserve." Morrison opened it carefully, read the first page, the second. Her expression went hard. "This is a confession to murder." "It is, and I'm the one turning it in. Because I grew up believing my father was a good man, and now I know he was a monster, and I can't live with that lie anymore." Wade walked over to Philip, this man he'd never met but understood completely. Both of them sons of flawed fathers. Both of them carrying inheritances they didn't want. Both of them choosing truth over comfort because comfort bought with lies wasn't comfort at all. "I'm Wade Hollister," he said, offering his hand. "Philip Kress." The handshake was firm despite the tremor in Philip's hands. "I'm sorry for what my father did. I know sorry doesn't bring Joseph back or give Helen her answers, but I'm sorry anyway." "Your father's crimes aren't yours," Wade said, the same words he'd said to Sarah. "But what you do now, that is yours, and you're doing the right thing." Philip looked at the grave, at Joseph's bones being lifted carefully from Montana earth. "My whole life is built on what my father stole. The ranch, the money, everything. I don't know how to make that right." "You start by telling the truth," Frank said, walking over. "You start by acknowledging what was done, and then you figure out what amends look like. It won't be enough. It can't ever be enough, but it's something." The media did come, exactly like Morrison had predicted. News trucks and reporters and cameras, all wanting to know about the rancher who'd been murdered in 1947 and the horse that had found him in 2014. Wade and Philip gave a joint statement, standing on the porch of the house where Helen had waited, telling the story of Joseph's confession and Martin's crime and the 67 years of silence that had hidden the truth. The story went viral, not because of the murder itself, though that was compelling enough, but because of Helen, the wife who'd waited 9 years, who'd refused to believe her husband had abandoned her, who died without knowing she was right. People connected with that. The faithful wife, the murdered husband, the truth that came too late. It touched something in the national consciousness, that story of love that survived death and doubt in decades. Joseph's remains were released after the forensic examination confirmed what they already knew. Bullet wound to the back of the head, death instantaneous, buried approximately 67 years ago in a shallow grave. Wade arranged for him to be reburied next to Helen, in the plot that had always been meant for him. The funeral was small, just Wade and Claire and Sarah and Frank and Philip, and a handful of people from town who remembered the story or had known Helen, or just believed that everyone deserved witnesses when they were finally laid to rest. The minister who'd agreed to do the service said a few words about love and faith and the importance of truth, even when it came late. Then Wade read from Joseph's letter to Helen, the one that had been buried in the smokehouse and found 67 years later. "I love you more than my own life, and that's why I have to do this. I can't keep poisoning our marriage with secrets, Tomorrow I confess. Tomorrow I try to make it right. If they send me to prison, wait for me if you can. If you can't, I understand. But I love you. I will always love you." Claire stepped forward and placed the ring on Joseph's coffin, the band that had circled his finger for 67 years in the ground, and would circle it again now in rest beside the woman he'd loved. Sarah placed a single white rose, an apology from a granddaughter for a grandfather's sin. Frank placed a handful of prairie grass, because Joseph had loved this land and died trying to keep it honestly. And Philip placed a typed letter. "It's a letter to Joseph's descendants," Philip said quietly, "promising to liquidate my father's estate and establish a restitution fund for the families of the Veterans Co-op. I can't bring Joseph back. I can't give Helen the answers she deserved while she lived, but I can try to balance scales that will never truly balance." They buried Joseph as the sun was setting, lowering the coffin into Montana earth for the second and final time. The headstone Wade had commissioned was simple. Joseph Brennan, 1906 to 1947. He tried to make it right. Next to it, Helen's stone now had an addition Wade had arranged. She never stopped believing. Together, the stones told a story of faith vindicated, love proven, truth delayed but not defeated. After the funeral, after everyone had left, Wade stood alone in the cemetery as the last light faded from the sky. He looked at the two graves, at the names carved in granite, at the dates that bookended two lives that had been too short and too painful, and too full of love that had never quite gotten the time it deserved. "You were right, Helen," Wade said aloud, talking to a woman who'd been dead for 58 years but whose faith had finally been proven true. "He didn't leave. He was trying to come back to you, and now you're together, 67 years late but together." He thought about Corinne, about his own 4 years of visiting her grave with apologies, about the confession he'd finally made to Claire and the weight that had lifted when the secret was spoken aloud, about how truth didn't erase pain or bring back the dead, but it made carrying the pain more bearable because you weren't carrying it alone anymore. Wade went back to the Brennan property that evening, to the house that was no longer frozen in grief, but was slowly becoming something else. Claire had spent the afternoon opening windows, letting fresh air blow through rooms that had been sealed for 67 years. She'd washed the dishes in the sink, finally, ceremonially, releasing Helen from the vigil she'd kept for nearly 7 decades. "The house feels different now," Claire said when Wade found her in the kitchen. "Lighter, like something that was holding its breath finally exhaled." "We gave them closure," Wade said. "Joseph and Helen, finally." "You gave them closure. You and Chance. You're the one who dug when everyone else had given up." Wade thought about that, about the $600 property purchase, about Chance's insistent pawing, about the lockbox and the journal and the terrible truth that had been waiting for someone to care enough to find it. "I just finished what Joseph started. He was the brave one. He was the one who decided to tell the truth even knowing it would cost him everything." Claire put her hand on his arm. "You decided to tell the truth too, Dad, about Mom, about not being there. That took courage." 4 years late. Joseph was 67 years late. Helen never got to hear the truth at all. "At least I'm alive to hear yours. At least we still have time to do something with it." Wade looked at his daughter, at the woman she'd become despite his emotional absence, at the grace she was offering him when he deserved none. "I want to turn this property into something that matters," he said. "The rescue ranch your mom always wanted. A place for broken horses and broken people. Helen Brennan Memorial Rescue Ranch. What do you think?" "I think Mom would love it," Claire said. "I think Helen would love it too." They stood in the kitchen that Helen had left frozen in time, and for the first time since Wade had bought the property, it felt like a place where living could happen instead of just a monument to waiting. The dishes were washed. The windows were open. The truth was told. and the dead could finally rest while the living figured out how to move forward. Sarah came by the next morning, looking exhausted but somehow lighter, like she'd been carrying a weight and finally put it down. She brought coffee and pastries from town and an envelope of papers. "I'm liquidating my grandfather's estate," she said without preamble. "Everything he owned, every property, every investment. I'm selling it all and putting the proceeds into the restitution fund Philip is establishing. I can't undo what my grandfather did, but I can make sure his wealth goes to the people he stole from instead of continuing to benefit his descendants." "That's a big decision," Wade said carefully. "You're giving up your inheritance." "I'm giving up blood money," Sarah corrected. "I don't want it. I don't want to build my life on what my grandfather stole. I'd rather start over with nothing and know it's clean than keep living in the shadow of his crimes." Wade understood that. He'd spent 4 years building a life in the shadow of his own failures, and it hadn't been living at all, just existing, just going through motions. The real living had started when he'd finally told the truth, when he'd finally stopped hiding from the hard things. "What will you do?" Wade asked. "I don't know yet," Sarah admitted. "But whatever it is, it'll be mine, earned honestly, built on truth instead of lies." She looked around the property at the house and barn and the land that had held secrets. "Can I volunteer here, at the rescue ranch? I think I need to do something good, something that helps instead of just taking." "You're always welcome," Wade said. Over the next weeks, the story continued to unfold. Forensic accountants traced Martin Kress's wealth and found that nearly everything he'd built had originated with the stolen co-op funds. Harrison Webb's estate showed similar patterns. The two men had been partners in crime for 54 years after Joseph's murder, covering for each other, profiting together, building empires on theft and blood. Descendants of the 13 co-op families came forward, some angry, some grieving, all of them wanting answers that had been denied for 67 years. Frank Hollies became something of a spokesman for them, this old veteran who'd kept silent out of fear and was finally able to speak truth without threat. Philip Kress followed through on his promise, liquidating a ranch empire worth over $3 million and dividing it among the co-op families and the descendants of the 3 other murdered veterans. His own children struggled with the decision, torn between wanting their inheritance and understanding why their father needed to make amends. In the end, they supported him, choosing their father's integrity over their grandfather's money. The Veterans Co-op Restitution Fund was established in Joseph Brennan's name, managed by a board that included Frank Hollies, Claire Hollister, and several descendants of the original members. The fund would provide financial assistance to families of veterans who'd been defrauded, a small balance against large injustice, but something. Sarah Bennett changed her name legally, dropping Webb and taking her mother's maiden name of Bennett permanently. She started a new real estate business focused on ethical practices and transparent dealings, building a reputation one honest transaction at a time. She volunteered at the rescue ranch 3 days a week, working with traumatized horses and finding that helping broken animals helped heal something broken in herself. Wade and Claire worked through that spring and summer, transforming the Brennan property from a shrine to loss into a functioning rescue operation. The house was restored, updated, turned into a place where living could happen instead of waiting. The barn was expanded, designed specifically for rehabilitating traumatized animals. Paddocks and fencing went up. An office was established. The Helen Brennan Memorial Rescue Ranch opened in August 2014 with 8 horses, all of them rescues, all of them broken in one way or another, all of them given the chance that Joseph had been denied and Helen had never stopped believing in. Chance was the lead horse, the elder statesman, teaching younger horses how to trust again. Wade watched him work with a traumatized Mustang, patient and calm and persistent, and saw what he'd learned himself. Healing wasn't fast and it wasn't linear and it didn't erase what had happened, but it was possible, and possible was enough. On the 1-year anniversary of finding Joseph's body, Wade stood by the graves with Claire and Sarah and Frank and Philip, a strange family built from tragedy and truth and the shared work of making amends. They didn't have a ceremony. They just stood together as the sun set, remembering the dead and acknowledging the living, grateful for the chance to do better than the people who'd come before them. "Thank you," Frank said, his voice thin but clear, "for finishing what Joseph started, for giving my wife's death meaning, for making sure we're not forgotten." "You were never forgotten," Wade said. "The truth was just buried, but buried things don't stay buried forever. They just wait for someone to dig." As they were leaving, Claire pulled Wade aside, her expression serious. "Dad, I've been thinking about the ranch, about what we're building here. I want to take a year off from teaching, help you get this really established, make it what Mom dreamed it could be." Wade felt something warm spread through his chest, something that felt like hope or healing or maybe just the recognition that it was never too late to start doing the next right thing. "I'd like that. I'd like that a lot." They walked to their trucks in the gathering darkness, this group of people who'd been brought together by murder and theft and 67 years of silence, now bound by the shared work of turning tragedy into something that helped instead of harmed. The dead were at rest, the truth was told, and the living had work to do. Wade looked back once at the graves where Joseph and Helen rested together, finally, and thought about all the ways love persisted beyond death, how faith could be validated decades after it seemed foolish, how truth had a way of surfacing no matter how deep you buried it. Chance was in the trailer, waiting patiently, this horse who'd known where secrets were buried and had insisted Wade dig until he found them. Wade reached through the bars and scratched behind the horse's ears. "We did it, boy," Wade said. "We found him, we told the truth. We finished what needed finishing." Chance nickered softly, that low rumble of contentment, and Wade understood. The horse had known from the beginning what needed to happen. He'd led Wade to the smokehouse, to the grave, to the truth that had been waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough or broken enough to dig it up. And now it was done. The secrets were exposed, the lies were answered, the dead were honored, and the living could begin the long, slow work of healing. Wade drove home through the Montana night, the stars brilliant overhead, the prairie vast and dark around him. He thought about Corinne and how he'd confessed to her grave the same way Joseph had confessed in his journal. He thought about Claire and the year they'd spend working together, building something that mattered. He thought about Joseph and Helen and the love that had survived 67 years of separation. And he thought about how truth was worth pursuing even when it came too late to change what happened, because truth honored the dead and freed the living, and made sure that suffering meant something instead of just being loss. The Brennan property was no longer haunted. The house was no longer frozen. The land no longer held secrets. And Wade Hollister, a man who'd spent 4 years apologizing to a headstone, had finally learned that the best apology was living the kind of life that honored what the dead had wanted for you. Truth had won. It had just taken 67 years and a horse who remembered to do it. The first rescue horse arrived on a Tuesday in September, hauled in a trailer by a woman from the Bureau of Land Management who looked like she'd seen too many animals suffer and not enough of them saved. The horse was a mare, maybe 15 years old, so thin Wade could count her ribs from across the paddock, coat dull and eyes empty in the way that meant she'd stopped hoping for anything better. Her name was listed as number 4738 on the paperwork, because the BLM didn't waste names on horses they expected to die. Wade took one look at her and saw himself 6 months ago, standing in a cemetery apologizing to a headstone, carrying guilt so heavy it had worn grooves in his shoulders. He saw Joseph Brennan lying in the ground for 67 years waiting for someone to care enough to dig. He saw Helen setting a table for two and waiting for a man who'd been murdered before he could come home. All that grief and loss and wasted time, concentrated in the hollow eyes of a starving horse who'd given up. "She's got maybe 2 weeks," the BLM woman said, handing Wade the transfer papers. "Maybe less. I'm not supposed to say this, but if you can't save her, a bullet would be kinder than letting her starve." Wade signed the papers and led the mare to a paddock they'd prepared specifically for critical cases, soft ground and shelter and food in small portions, because a starving animal couldn't handle abundance all at once. Claire was waiting there with a bucket of warm water and a veterinary blanket, her teacher's instincts kicking in the way they did with anything broken that needed patience. "What are we calling her?" Claire asked, draping the blanket over the mare's protruding spine. Wade thought about Helen's diary, about the way she'd written "I never stopped believing" on page after page for 9 years, faith in the face of every reason to give up. "Faith," he said. "We're calling her Faith." The mare stood in the paddock without moving, too exhausted to care about the food in front of her or the humans trying to help or anything, except the simple fact of still being alive when she'd expected to be dead. Wade stayed with her until dark, just being present, talking softly about nothing important, letting her get used to the idea that this place was different from wherever she'd been before. Chance watched from the neighboring paddock, his calm presence a counterpoint to Faith's desperation. Wade had noticed over the months that Chance seemed to understand the other horses in a way that went beyond normal herd dynamics. He'd position himself where traumatized horses could see him, would pace the fence line when they were agitated, would stand utterly still when they needed stillness. It was like he remembered being broken and knew the path back to whole. By October, the ranch had 12 horses, each one a rescue, each one carrying its own trauma. Faith had stabilized, was eating regularly, had put on enough weight that her ribs didn't show quite so prominently. A gelding named Storm had come in with rope burns around his neck and a terror of anything that looked like a halter. A pony called Dusty had been found abandoned in a foreclosed property, standing in her own filth, hooves so overgrown she could barely walk. Wade and Claire worked with them all, patient and persistent, celebrating small victories like the day Storm let Wade slip a halter on without panicking, or the morning Dusty took 3 sound steps after the farrier trimmed her hooves. Sarah came 3 days a week, arriving early and staying late, working in the barn and paddocks with a dedication that spoke to penance as much as passion. She was different now, lighter somehow, like liquidating her grandfather's estate had freed her from a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. She'd sold the last property 2 weeks ago, transferred the final payment to the restitution fund, and walked away from everything Harrison Webb had built. "How does it feel?" Wade asked her one afternoon as they were mucking stalls together, "being broke?" Sarah laughed, a sound Wade hadn't heard from her before, genuine and surprised. "I'm not broke. I have a small apartment and a car that runs and enough in savings to pay bills for 6 months while I rebuild my business honestly. That's not broke. That's free." In November, a man showed up at the ranch driving a truck that had seen better decades and carrying himself like someone who'd forgotten how to stand up straight. He was maybe 55, Vietnam veteran written in the set of his shoulders, and the way his eyes scanned the horizon for threats that weren't there. His name was Marcus Hayes, and he'd heard about the ranch from his VA counselor, who thought working with horses might help with the PTSD that had been eating him alive for 43 years. Wade recognized him immediately, not because they'd met before, but because he was looking at a mirror. The same guilt in the eyes, the same weight in the walk, The same way of existing in the world like you were taking up space you hadn't earned and didn't deserve. I don't know anything about horses, Marcus said, standing in the driveway like he might run at any moment. But my counselor said you take volunteers, said working with animals helps. It does, Wade said, if you let it. Marcus stayed. Started coming 3 days a week, then 5, then 7. Wade put him to work mucking stalls and filling water troughs and doing the simple repetitive tasks that kept a ranch running, the kind of work that occupied your hands and quieted your mind. Marcus didn't talk much at first, just worked, but Wade could see the tension in him, the way he startled at loud noises, the way he positioned himself so he could see all the exits. It was Chance who broke through. The horse approached Marcus one morning while he was cleaning a stall, walked right up and pressed his head against Marcus's chest, that particular gesture horses use when they're offering comfort or asking for it. Marcus froze, hands out, not knowing what to do. Chance just stood there, breathing slow and even, until Marcus's hands came down and touched the horse's neck. I haven't let anyone touch me in 20 years, Marcus said later, sitting on a hay bale with Chance's head resting on his shoulder. Not my wife, not my kids, nobody. Couldn't stand it. Felt like my skin was on fire every time someone got close. He ran his hand down Chance's neck, the gesture gentle and careful. But this is okay. Wade watched from the barn door and thought about Corinne, about how he'd pulled away from her in the last years of her life, too buried in work and guilt to let her close. Thought about Claire growing up with a father who was physically present but emotionally somewhere else, fighting battles in his own head that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with his inability to forgive himself for being human. "What are you running from?" Wade asked. Marcus didn't answer right away, kept petting Chance, the rhythm of it steady and soothing. Finally he said, 1971, firebase outside Da Nang, we got overrun. I was supposed to be on perimeter watch but I fell asleep. Hadn't slept in 3 days and I fell asleep. His voice went flat. They came through where I was supposed to be watching. Killed 6 guys. 6 guys died because I couldn't stay awake. Wade sat down on the hay bale next to him, not touching, just being present. You carry that every day. Every minute of every day for 43 years. Marcus's hands were shaking now, but he kept petting Chance and the horse stood perfectly still, absorbing the tremor. My wife left me. My kids won't talk to me. I've tried to kill myself 3 times. And I can't tell you why I'm still here except I'm apparently too much of a coward to finish what I should have finished in 1971. You're not a coward, Wade said. Cowards don't carry guilt for 43 years. Cowards don't keep getting up every morning when getting up is the hardest thing in the world. Cowards don't come to a ranch they've never seen to work with animals they don't understand because maybe, just maybe, it might help. Marcus turned to look at him, and Wade saw the question in his eyes. The same question Wade had been asking himself for 4 years. How do you live with what you've done? How do you forgive yourself when forgiveness feels like betrayal? I don't know how to let it go, Marcus whispered. You don't let it go, Wade said. You carry it, but you carry it forward instead of letting it hold you back. You make it mean something instead of just being weight. You do something with it. You help someone else carry their weight. You make the world a little less broken than you found it. Marcus came back the next day and the day after that. Wade watched him work with Faith, the starving mare who was slowly learning to trust that food would keep coming and pain wouldn't. There was something in the way Marcus approached her, gentle and patient and utterly without expectation, that reminded Wade of how you had to approach your own healing. Not demanding, not forcing, just showing up and doing the next right thing and believing that small steps eventually covered distance. In December, Claire found something while cleaning out the old farmhouse, preparing to turn one of the upstairs bedrooms into an office. She was working in Helen's bedroom, going through the closet, when she noticed that one of the floorboards was loose. Not damaged loose, but deliberately loose, like it had been designed to come up. "Dad," she called, "I think you should see this." Wade came upstairs to find Claire kneeling by the closet, the floorboard removed, staring into a space that had been hidden for 67 years. Inside was a metal box, similar to the one Joseph had buried in the smokehouse but smaller. Claire lifted it out carefully, set it on the bed, and opened it. Inside were savings bonds. Dozens of them, issued between 1947 and 1956, all made out to bearer instead of a specific name. Claire started counting, her hands shaking slightly, and when she finished, she looked at Wade with wide eyes. $43,000, she said. At 1950s values, with interest and maturity, these are probably worth close to $200,000 today. Beneath the bonds was a letter in Helen's handwriting, dated March 1956, addressed to whoever finds this. Wade read it aloud, his voice catching on the words. "I'm leaving this money for Joseph. I saved it over 9 years, putting aside every penny I could, believing he would come back and we would need it to start over. If you're reading this, I'm gone and he never returned. But I want whoever finds this to know, I saved this for us, for our future, for the life I believed we would still have together. If Joseph is dead, if he never comes back, then I want this money used for something good, something that honors second chances. Because everyone deserves a second chance, even people who make terrible mistakes, even people who run away, even people who break promises. Use this money to help someone who's broken. Use it to give hope to someone who's lost it. Use it to prove that love doesn't end just because life does. Use it to show that faith matters, even when it seems foolish. I loved him until my last breath. I'm leaving this as proof. Love never stops hoping, never stops believing, never stops waiting." The letter was signed with Helen's name and dated 2 days before she left the house for the last time. Wade sat on the bed where Helen had slept alone for 9 years, holding her letter, surrounded by the evidence of her faith made tangible. She'd saved for Joseph. She'd believed he would come back. And when he didn't, she'd left the money not for herself, not for her family, but for whoever might continue the work of giving broken things second chances. "She knew," Claire whispered. "She knew what we'd build here. She prepared for it." "She prepared for him," Wade corrected. "But she left it for us, for this." He looked at the bonds, at the letter, at the trust Helen had placed in the future even when her present was nothing but pain. "We're using this for the ranch, every penny, the way she wanted." The Helen Brennan Memorial Rescue Ranch expanded significantly with Helen's gift. They built a second barn, specifically designed for critical care cases. They installed a round pen for training traumatized horses. They hired a part-time veterinarian and a full-time farrier. They established a volunteer program and started taking in horses from all over Montana, not just BLM Mustangs but owner surrenders, abuse cases, animals that had been given up on. By February, Faith was sound enough to begin basic training. Marcus worked with her every day, his own healing tangled up with hers in ways neither of them could articulate, but both of them felt. Wade watched them in the round pen, man and horse moving in slow circles, learning trust together, and thought about how healing was always a mutual thing. You couldn't fix someone else without fixing yourself a little in the process. "Marcus is getting better," Claire said one evening as they were closing up the barn. "He's sleeping more, eating more. His wife called yesterday, first time in 3 years. They're talking about maybe trying again." "Faith's getting better too," Wade said. "Funny how that works." "It's not funny. It's what this place is for." Claire leaned against the barn door, looking out at the paddocks where horses grazed in the winter twilight. Mom knew this. She knew that helping broken things helped heal the broken parts in yourself. That's why she wanted this so badly. Wade thought about Corinne's dream, about how he dismissed it as impractical, about how he'd been so focused on surviving that he'd forgotten about living. I should have listened to her. You're listening now, that's what matters. In March, Wade called the BLM office to check on Chance's background. He'd been curious about the horse's uncanny ability to sense where secrets were buried, to lead Wade to the smokehouse, and then to Joseph's grave. The woman who answered was the same one who'd brought Faith months earlier. Chance came from a wild herd in the valley east of Great Falls, she said. We rounded them up in 2005. Most got adopted, but Chance was too traumatized. Spent 8 years in holding before you took him. Papers shuffled. His dam was a mare we called Spirit. She died during the roundup. Heart attack from the stress. Where was Spirit from? Wade asked. Born wild in that valley. Her dam too, going back several generations. That herd's been running those hills since at least the 50s, maybe longer. They're descended from ranch horses that went feral when properties were abandoned. Wade felt something click in his mind. What properties? Old homesteads. There were a bunch of ranches in that valley back in the 40s, mostly failed during the drought years. Animals got loose, formed wild herds. Happens a lot out here. Wade thanked her and hung up, his mind racing. Chance had been born in 2005 to a mare named Spirit who'd been born wild in the late 90s. Spirit's dam would have been born in the 80s, her dam in the 60s. 4 or 5 generations back, that bloodline would have been running on ranches in the 40s. Ranches like the Brennan Place. He drove out to the property that afternoon, stood in the barn Joseph had built, and looked at the old tack room where photographs still hung on the wall. There were pictures of Joseph with his horses, Helen standing next to a mare with a distinctive blaze and white stockings, a young foal in a paddock, legs too long for its body. Wade took one of the photographs down carefully. Written on the back in faded ink, Sergeant's Lady, 1943. He drove to the county clerk's office and requested livestock records for the Brennan Ranch, specifically breeding documentation from the 40s. The clerk pulled dusty ledgers from storage. There it was, recorded in Joseph's handwriting. Breeding stock, 1943. Sergeant, gelding. Lady, mare. Foal expected spring 1944. Chance was descended from Joseph's horses. The bloodline had run wild for 60 years, generation after generation living in the valley where their ancestors had been born, and somehow that genetic memory had persisted. That's how Chance had known where to dig. That's how he'd led Wade to the smokehouse and the grave. He wasn't sensing ghosts or following supernatural signs. He was following memory bred into his bones. Ancestral knowledge of trauma that had happened on land his great-great-great-grandmother had walked. Wade sat in the clerk's office with the evidence in his hands and felt the full weight of what he'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about solving a murder or giving Helen her answer. This was about bloodlines and memory and the way trauma echoed through generations, affecting descendants who'd never known the original wound but carried its shape anyway. He drove back to the ranch and found Chance in his paddock, the horse grazing peacefully in the late winter sun. Wade stood at the fence and thought about all the things he'd inherited from his own father. The debts and the silence and the way avoiding hard truths had been easier than facing them. He thought about Claire inheriting his emotional distance. He thought about Philip Kress inheriting a ranch built on murder money. He thought about Sarah carrying her grandfather's crimes. "You've been carrying this a long time, haven't you, boy?" Wade said softly. "Carrying something you didn't even know you were carrying. Something that happened before you were born but marked you anyway." Chance raised his head and looked at Wade with those knowing eyes, and Wade understood. This was why the horse had been so insistent about the digging. Not because he understood intellectually what Joseph's murder meant, but because the land itself remembered trauma, and chance was connected to that land through bloodlines that transcended normal experience. By the time spring arrived fully in April 2015, 1 year after Wade had bought the property, the Helen Brennan Memorial Rescue Ranch had saved 26 horses and was helping 4 human volunteers find healing alongside the animals. Faith had been adopted by a family with a teenage daughter recovering from an eating disorder, the girl and the horse healing together. Storm had learned to trust halters and humans and found a home with a retired Marine who understood trauma. Marcus was sleeping without nightmares for the first time in 43 years. His wife had moved back in, and his oldest son had called to say he wanted to visit. On the anniversary of finding Joseph's body, Wade held a small ceremony at the property. Claire and Sarah and Marcus and Philip and Frank Hollies, along with a handful of volunteers and descendants of co-op families. They stood by the graves where Joseph and Helen rested and talked about the year that had passed, about truth and healing, and the way finishing what someone else started could change you in ways you never expected. Marcus spoke, his voice steady in a way it hadn't been when he'd first arrived. "I came here because I was drowning. I'm still drowning some days, but some days I'm not. And the not drowning days are getting more frequent." He looked at Wade. "You told me to carry the weight forward instead of letting it hold me back. I'm trying. Some days I succeed." Claire read from Helen's letter about the hidden money, the one where Helen wrote about love never stopping its hoping or believing. "She waited 9 years," Claire said, "not because she was naive, but because she knew the truth even when everyone else called it a lie. That kind of faith matters." Sarah spoke about liquidating her grandfather's estate and starting over. "I grew up rich in money and poor in honesty. Now I'm the opposite, and I'm happier than I've ever been." Philip placed flowers on both graves. "My father took something from this world he couldn't give back, but we can give other things. We can give truth and justice and proof that wrongs eventually get righted, even if it takes 67 years. Wade was last. He stood between the graves and thought about all the threads that had woven together to bring him here. Corinne's death and his guilt. The $600 property sale. Chance's insistence. Joseph's buried confession and Helen's faithful waiting. The decision to tell truth instead of hiding it. All of it leading to this moment, standing on ground that had held secrets and now held only memory and peace. "A year ago I was standing at my wife's grave apologizing for not being there when she died," Wade said. "I thought that was my story, my guilt, my failure. Turns out it was just the beginning of understanding what carrying guilt means and what letting it go looks like." He put his hand on Joseph's headstone. "Joseph tried to make it right. He failed because someone stopped him, but the trying mattered, the intention mattered. And 67 years later, his trying started something that's helped save 26 horses and at least 4 people that I know of." He moved his hand to Helen's stone. Helen never stopped believing, even when everyone told her she was wrong. She believed in love and faith and the possibility that truth would eventually surface. She was right. She just didn't live to see it, but her belief mattered. Her waiting mattered. Her hidden gift of $43,000 made sure this ranch could do what she'd always believed was possible, give broken things second chances. Wade stepped back and looked at the assembled group. "We're all carrying something. Something we did or something done to us or something we inherited from people who died before we were born. We can let it bury us the way Joseph was buried, or we can dig it up, face it, and make it mean something." That evening, after everyone had left, Wade sat on the porch of the farmhouse with Chance grazing nearby and Claire beside him, reading one of Helen's teaching journals they'd found in the attic. The sun was setting over the Montana prairie, turning the sky orange and purple and gold. "I think Mom would be proud of this," Claire said, looking up from the journal. "Not just the ranch, but you, the way you've changed." "I'm still changing," Wade said. Some days I backslide, some days I don't know what I'm doing. That's called being human, Dad. You're allowed. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only happens when two people trust each other enough to not fill every moment with words. Wade thought about the year that had passed, about everything he'd learned about guilt and redemption and healing. He thought about Joseph and Helen and the love that had survived death. He thought about Marcus learning to be touched again, and Philip giving away millions to balance scales that could never truly balance, and Faith gaining weight and Storm trusting halters, and all the small miracles that happened when you committed to doing the next right thing. Chance raised his head from grazing and looked toward the road, ears pricked forward, sensing something before Wade could see it. A car was coming up the drive, moving slowly. It pulled up and parked, and an elderly woman got out, moving carefully like her bones hurt, but her determination was stronger than her pain. Wade recognized her from photographs he'd seen in the house. Joseph's daughter, the 6-year-old girl who'd lost her father in 1947 and grown up believing he'd abandoned her. Ruth Brennan, now 79 years old, walking toward him with tears already streaming down her face. "I'm Ruth," she said, her voice breaking. "Joseph was my father. I saw the news. I needed to come." Wade took her hands, these fragile hands that had waited 79 years to know the truth about her father. "He loved you," Wade said. "He wrote it in his journal. He was trying to make things right so you could grow up proud of his name." Ruth's tears fell harder. "I've spent my whole life angry at him, angry that he left us, angry that he stole money and ran away, and now I find out he didn't run. He was murdered trying to confess." "He was a good man who made one bad choice," Wade said, "and he died trying to fix that choice. That matters." Ruth stayed for 3 days, and in those 3 days, Wade watched a 79-year-old woman recover a father she'd lost when she was 6. She read Joseph's journal, every page of it. She visited the graves and wept and talked to parents who'd been dead for decades. She worked in the barn with the horses and found some measure of peace in doing the work her father had loved. When she left, she hugged Wade tight and said thank you for giving her father back to her. And Wade understood that truth had power even when it came too late to change what happened, because truth honored the dead and freed the living and made sure suffering meant something instead of just being loss. The ranch continued to grow through that summer and into fall. More horses, more volunteers, more small miracles of healing. And through it all, Chance remained the steady center, the horse who'd started everything, the living proof that some memories lived in blood and bone and waited generations to find voice. Wade was 62 now, moving slower than he used to but still showing up every day, still doing the work. And he'd learned what Karen had tried to teach him years ago, that the broken things were worth saving, that patience and love could heal wounds that seemed permanent, and that it was never too late to start living the kind of life that honored what the dead had wanted for you. The truth had set them all free. It had just taken 67 years and a horse who remembered to do it. Ruth Brennan stayed for 3 days, and in those 3 days Wade watched a 79-year-old woman recover a father she'd lost when she was 6. She slept in the house where her parents had lived, in the bedroom that had been hers as a child, and woke each morning crying because she could remember now, could see her father's face in the kitchen making breakfast, could hear his voice reading her stories before bed, could feel the weight of being loved by a man she'd spent 67 years believing had abandoned her. Wade gave her Joseph's journal to read, all of it, every page of guilt and confession and love. She sat on the porch in the spring sunshine and read her father's words, tears streaming down her face, one hand pressed to her mouth like she was trying to hold in sounds too big for her body to contain. When she finished, she looked at Wade with eyes that were red and swollen but somehow lighter than they'd been when she arrived. He was going to confess, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He was terrified, but he was going to do it anyway because living with the lie was killing him. He loved you and your mother more than he feared prison, Wade said. That's what the journal says, over and over, that he couldn't keep poisoning his family with secrets. Ruth turned to the page where Joseph had written about her specifically. The entry dated March 10, 1947, 8 days before he died. Wade had read it himself and knew what it said, but hearing Ruth read it aloud was different, was harder, was the sound of a daughter finally understanding what her father had been. Ruth is 6 years old today, Ruth read, her voice shaking. We had cake and she blew out candles and wished for a pony. Helen laughed and said we'd see. I watched my daughter's face, so full of joy and trust, and knew I was about to destroy that. When I confess, when everyone knows what I did, she'll grow up as the thief's daughter. Kids will whisper about her. Adults will pity her. She'll carry my shame for the rest of her life. But if I don't confess, I'm teaching her that lying is acceptable. I'd rather she grow up ashamed of a father who tried to make things right than proud of a father who never had the courage to face what he'd done. I'm so sorry, Ruth. I hope someday you can forgive me. The silence after she finished reading was broken only by horses moving in paddocks and wind through grass and Ruth's quiet weeping. Wade sat beside her and let her cry, knowing that some grief needed time and space, and the simple presence of someone who understood that pain was part of healing. He never got to confess, Ruth said finally. He never got to make it right. He tried, that's what matters. He chose courage over comfort. He chose truth over safety. And he died before he could complete it, but the intention was there. The love was there. Ruth looked out at the land her father had died trying to keep honestly. My mother told me he ran away, told me he was a coward who stole money and abandoned us. I believed her because what else was I supposed to believe? I was 6 years old and my father was gone and everyone said he left us. She wiped her eyes with shaking hands. I've hated him my whole life, and he was trying to protect me the whole time. Your mother didn't know the truth, Wade said gently. She spent 9 years looking for him, believing he'd come back. She died not knowing he'd been murdered. She died thinking maybe he had run away. But she never stopped loving him. That's in her diary, page after page. Can I see the letter? Ruth asked. The one he wrote to her, the one she never got. Wade brought out Joseph's letter to Helen, the one that had been buried in the smokehouse for 67 years. Ruth held it like it was made of light and read her father's final words to her mother. When she reached the end, she folded it carefully and held it against her chest. They loved each other so much, she whispered, and they got so little time together. 15 years of marriage and then he was gone and she spent 9 more years waiting and then she was gone too. But it was real, Wade said. The love was real. That's what survives everything else. Ruth stayed to help at the ranch, working alongside Claire in the barn, learning how to feed horses and muck stalls and do the simple physical work that quieted the mind and healed the heart. She was good with the damaged animals, patient in a way that came from understanding what it meant to be broken and slowly pieced back together. Faith, the mare, took to her especially, would walk over when Ruth entered the paddock and rest her head on Ruth's shoulder. Two creatures who'd survived starvation of different kinds, finding comfort in each other. On the third evening, Ruth asked Wade to take her to her parents' graves. They drove to the Billings Cemetery in the long light of late afternoon, the sun turning everything golden. The joint headstone stood beneath a tree that had grown tall, and Ruth stood before it for a long time without speaking, just looking at names carved in granite. I brought you something, Ruth said finally, kneeling to place a photograph at the base of the stone. It was old, faded, showing a little girl with dark braids standing between her parents, all three of them smiling. This is from 1946, a year before you died, Dad. 6 months before you died, Mom. We were happy. I remember being happy." She traced her father's name with one finger. "I'm sorry I hated you. I'm sorry I believed the worst. I'm sorry I didn't get to know who you really were." Her voice broke. "But I know now, and I'm proud to be your daughter. I'm proud you tried to do the right thing even when it cost you everything." Wade stood back, giving her privacy, watching this elderly woman make peace with parents who'd been dead longer than she'd known them alive. This was what truth did. It didn't erase pain or bring back the dead or fix what was broken, but it gave people the chance to understand, to forgive, to let go of wrong stories and hold onto true ones. Ruth stood and turned to Wade, her face wet with tears but her expression peaceful in a way it hadn't been when she'd arrived. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for digging. Thank you for not letting this stay buried. Thank you for giving me my father back." "He never left," Wade said. "He was always yours, you just didn't know it." After Ruth left to drive back to her home in Bozeman, promising to return often and volunteer whenever she could, Wade found himself alone in the house that had belonged to Joseph and Helen. He walked through rooms that were no longer frozen in time, that Claire had slowly transformed from shrine to home, and felt the ghosts finally settling. Not disappearing, because what happened here would always be part of the land's history, but becoming peaceful, becoming memory instead of haunting. He went to Corinne's grave the next morning, the first time he'd visited since confessing to Claire about not being there when Corinne died. The flowers he'd left before were dried and faded, and he replaced them with fresh ones, prairie wildflowers that Corinne had loved. "I finished it," Wade told the headstone. "The rescue ranch, it's up and running. We've saved 26 horses so far. Claire's helping run it. She took a year off teaching, and I think she's going to make it permanent." He sat on the grass. "I'm trying to be better. I'm trying to be the kind of person you believed I could be. I'm showing up. I'm being present. I'm telling the truth even when it's hard." He put his hand on the stone. "I miss you. I'll always miss you, but I'm learning to live with the missing instead of drowning in it." A meadowlark called from somewhere nearby, that distinctive song Corinne had loved, and Wade closed his eyes and let himself believe for a moment that she could hear him, that somewhere she knew he was trying. When he opened his eyes, Claire was walking toward him across the cemetery grass, moving quietly. She sat down beside him without speaking, and they sat together in front of Corinne's grave, father and daughter, silent in the way that meant understanding. "Mom would be proud of you," Claire said finally. "You think?" "I know. She wanted you to heal. She wanted you to help other broken things. She wanted you to stop running from your own heart." Claire leaned her head on Wade's shoulder. "You're doing all of that. 4 years late. You're here now, that's what matters." The ranch grew through that spring and summer, taking in more horses, helping more people. Marcus brought his wife to visit, a small, quiet woman who'd spent 20 years married to a man who couldn't let anyone touch him, and Wade watched them walk through the paddocks hand in hand, Marcus pointing out horses and explaining their stories, his wife crying and laughing and holding onto her husband like she'd gotten him back from the dead. "3 months ago I didn't think we'd make it," Marcus told Wade. "Marriage was over, just a matter of paperwork. Now we're talking about renewing our vows." He shook his head in wonder. "I don't know what you did, what this place did, but it saved my life." "You saved your own life," Wade said. "You showed up, you did the work, you let yourself heal." By autumn, Sarah had rebuilt her real estate business from the ground up, operating with a transparency and ethical standard that slowly earned her a reputation as someone you could trust. She'd started dating the ranch's farrier, a quiet man named Daniel who'd lost his leg in Iraq and understood what it meant to rebuild yourself from damage. They were careful with each other, gentle, taking their time because both of them knew that healing wasn't fast. Philip had sold the last of his father's property and bought 40 acres of good land with money he'd earned himself. He ran a small cattle operation and volunteered at the ranch 3 days a week, working with the horses too traumatized for casual handling, using the patience he'd learned from dismantling an empire to help animals learn trust again. "I sleep better now," Philip told Wade one afternoon. "I spent a year not sleeping, just lying awake thinking about my father's crimes. Now I've got a place I bought with clean money, doing work that helps, and I sleep like a baby." Frank Hollies passed away peacefully in December, at home, surrounded by family. His daughter called Wade to let him know, said her father had asked her to tell Wade thank you for finishing what Joseph Brennan had started. Thank you for making sure the truth came out. Thank you for giving meaning to 67 years of silence and survivors' guilt. The funeral was small, and Wade spoke, talking about Frank's courage in finally speaking truth after decades of fear, about how Frank had honored his friend Joseph by making sure his memory was restored. They buried Frank in the Dutton Cemetery, not far from where his wife Sarah was buried, finally reuniting them after 67 years of separation. 5 years passed. Not quickly, not easily, but steadily, the way healing always happened when you committed to the work. The Helen Brennan Memorial Rescue Ranch became a fixture in Montana's rescue community, known for taking the hardest cases, the horses everyone else had given up on. 214 horses had been saved by 2019. Some were rehabilitated and adopted. Some lived out their lives at the ranch, too damaged to ever leave but safe and cared for. All of them mattered. Wade was 63 now, gray in his hair and lines in his face, and a peace in his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. He'd learned to carry his guilt about Corinne differently, not as a weight that crushed him but as a reminder to be present, to show up, to tell truth before it was too late. He visited her grave once a month, brought flowers, talked to her about the ranch and Claire and the life he was building that honored what she'd wanted. Claire had married Daniel the farrier, and they lived in the renovated farmhouse on the Brennan property with their 2-year-old daughter. The little girl's name was Helen Corinne Mercer, named after 2 women who taught them about faith and love and the importance of second chances. She was fearless around the horses, toddling through the barn with Chance following behind her like a guardian, the old horse now 16 but still teaching, still patient, still the heart of everything they'd built. Marcus ran a support group for veterans with PTSD, using the ranch as a meeting place, teaching other broken soldiers that healing was possible. He'd reconciled with both his children and was rebuilding relationships that had been destroyed by 43 years of untreated trauma. His wife had become a volunteer counselor at the VA, helping other spouses understand and support partners with PTSD. Sarah and Daniel had married quietly in the spring, a small ceremony at the ranch with just family and the horses as witnesses. Sarah had legally changed her last name again, taking Daniel's, finally severing the last connection to the web name. She'd written a book about her grandfather's crimes and her journey to redemption through restitution, and it had helped thousands of people navigate their own inherited guilt and shame. Ruth visited monthly, driving up from Bozeman with stories about her parents and staying to work with the horses. She'd reconnected with siblings she hadn't spoken to in decades, sharing the truth about their father, watching family heal across generations. She'd started a foundation in Joseph and Helen's names, helping families of crime victims find closure. On the 5th anniversary of finding Joseph's remains, on a perfect Montana spring day in 2019, Wade and Claire and Sarah and Marcus and Philip and Ruth and little Helen Corinne stood by the graves and read from Joseph's journal and Helen's diary, keeping the story alive, making sure no one forgot. Little Helen Corinne, 2 years old with her grandmother's eyes and her great-great-grandmother's name, listened with the solemn attention children give to important things they don't fully understand. Why did they have to wait so long? The little girl asked, looking at the headstones. Because sometimes truth takes time to surface, Wade told her, lifting her onto his lap. But it always does eventually if someone cares enough to look for it. Will you tell me the story? Helen Corinne asked. The whole story. Wade looked at Claire, at Ruth, at the land that had held secrets and pain and eventually peace, and nodded. Yeah, sweetheart, I'll tell you the whole story. He told her about a man who tried to do the right thing and the wife who never stopped believing in him. About how broken things could heal if you gave them time and patience and love. About a horse who remembered where truth was buried. About how it was never too late to start doing the next right thing. Chance stood in his paddock nearby, grazing peacefully on grass that grew where secrets had once been buried, and Wade thought about how far they'd all come. The ranch had become more than a place for rescuing horses. It was a place where people came to rescue themselves, to learn that carrying guilt didn't make you noble, it just made you tired, and that the best way to honor the dead was to live better than they'd been able to. The sun set over the Montana prairie, turning the sky orange and gold and purple, painting the land in colors that made everything look new even when it was ancient. Wade held his granddaughter and told her about love that survived death and faith that outlasted doubt, and a horse who'd known things humans had forgotten how to see. And in the telling, in the passing of the story to the next generation, in making sure that what happened here would never be forgotten, Wade finished what Joseph had started 67 years before. He told the truth. He honored the dead. He made the love and the loss and the tragedy mean something beyond itself. The little girl fell asleep in his arms as the stars came out, one by one, filling the vast Montana sky with light. Wade sat holding her and watching darkness settle over the land, feeling the weight of 4 years of guilt finally, completely, lift from his shoulders. Corinne was at peace. Joseph and Helen were together. The horses were healing. The people were whole. And Wade Hollister, a man who'd spent 4 years apologizing for not being there when it mattered, had finally learned how to be present. He'd learned that truth set you free, even when it came too late to change what happened. He'd learned that second chances were real if you were willing to do the work. He'd learned that broken things could heal, and that healing happened in community, not isolation. Chance was 16 now, officially retired from active work but still teaching in his quiet way, still standing calm and patient when traumatized horses needed an example of what healed looked like. His bloodline had been confirmed through DNA testing, traced back 5 generations to Sergeant and Lady, the horses Joseph had bred in the 1940s. Scientists had written papers about genetic memory and ancestral trauma, using chance as a case study in how pain could echo through bloodlines and manifest in descendants who'd never experienced the original wound. But to Wade, chance wasn't a case study. He was the horse who'd started everything, the horse who'd known where to dig, the horse who'd refused to let secrets stay buried, the horse who'd taught Wade that some truths were worth pursuing no matter how deep they were buried or how long they'd been hidden. On quiet evenings, Wade would stand by Chance's paddock and thank the horse for his insistence, his patience, his refusal to accept that the past should stay buried. And Chance would rest his head on Wade's shoulder in that gesture horses use when they're offering comfort or accepting it, and they'd stand there together as the sun set and the stars emerged, 2 beings who'd both learned that memory lived in bones and blood, and sometimes the only way to heal was to dig up what hurt and bring it into the light. The Helen Brennan Memorial Rescue Ranch continued its work, year after year, saving horses and people both. The story of Joseph and Helen became part of Montana folklore, taught in schools, referenced in discussions about justice delayed and love vindicated. The property that had once been haunted by secrets became holy ground, a place where people came to learn that truth mattered and healing was possible, and that it was never too late to start living right. Wade lived to be 82, long enough to see little Helen Corinne grow into a young woman who chose to become a veterinarian, inspired by the ranch where she'd grown up, long enough to see the ranch save over 1,000 horses, long enough to know that Corinne would have been proud, that Joseph and Helen would have approved, that the life he'd built on truth was solid in ways the life he'd built on avoidance never could have been. When Wade died peacefully in 2037, they buried him in the Billings Cemetery next to Corinne, finally reuniting them after 27 years of separation. But his legacy lived on at the ranch, in the horses that continued to heal, in the people who continued to find themselves through helping broken animals, in the story that continued to be told. And through it all, generation after generation of Chance's descendants worked at the ranch, bloodline continuing, memory persisting, proving that some truths lived in bones and waited patiently for someone willing to listen. The truth had set them all free. It had just taken 67 years and a horse who remembered to do it. But once the truth was out, once the secrets were exposed, once the lies were answered with honesty, the healing could begin. And healing, Wade had learned, was the point of everything. Healing was worth pursuing. Healing was worth fighting for. Healing was worth the pain of digging up what hurt. Because in the end, truth honored the dead and freed the living, and made sure that suffering meant something instead of just being loss. And that, Wade believed until his last breath, was the only legacy worth leaving. The stars wheeled overhead, the Montana prairie stretched forever, the horses grazed in peace, and the truth that had been buried for 67 years shone bright as daylight, a testament to love and faith and the stubborn refusal of some souls to let injustice have the final word. Joseph and Helen Brennan could finally rest. Wade and Corinne Hollister could finally rest. And the land that had held so many secrets for so long could finally just be land again, beautiful and wild and free, home to horses and truth, and the kind of peace that only came when you stopped running from hard things and learned to face them instead. The horse that remembered had remembered truly. The man who dug had dug deeply enough. The truth that waited had finally been found. And in the finding, in the telling, in the honoring, everyone touched by the story had learned the same lesson. It's never too late to do the right thing. It's never too late to tell the truth. It's never too late to give broken things second chances. And love, real love, the kind that weathers death and doubt and decades, never dies. It just waits, patient and persistent, for someone to remember it and speak its name and prove that faith was justified all along. The end of the story was really just the beginning of healing. And healing was the work of a lifetime, passed down through generations, carried forward by those who remembered and those who refused to forget. The truth had won, and in winning it had set everyone free.